Our first speaker in this final session, then, is, again, another Caltech scientist here who works in this very subject of consciousness, or at least the study of the brain indirectly there. Dr. John Allman is in the Department of Molecular, Cellular, and Integrative Neuroscience in the Biology Division here at Caltech. He conducts research on the evolution and development of the brain. We have his book, The Evolving Brain, from Scientific American Press there, in which he looks at the reconstruction of the cerebral cortex, the interface between emotion and cognition, the relationship between the anterior cingulate cortex and attention deficit disorder, and depression, obsessive-compulsive disorder, phobias, post-traumatic stress disorder. So we've had some overlap. This will be good for today, looking at the brain. And he's the person who's really made the most progress in looking at these spindle-shaped neurons that seem to be related to emotion and social behavior that virtually no other mammals have, exception of a few other of the great apes. So there might be something key to that. John will also be lecturing today on intuition. So from a brain's point of view, from a neuroscience point of view, should be very interesting. With that, Dr. John Allman.
Thank you. First of all, can you all hear me? You can hear me fine. Okay, good. Okay, so I'm actually going to start with a definition, since it's useful to have definitions. And I want to talk about intuition. So this is strictly provisional. It's something that's work in progress. I speak of intuition as a form of cognition in which many variables are rapidly evaluated in parallel and compressed into a single dimension. This compression facilitates fast decision-making. Typically, we are not aware of the logical steps or assumptions underlying this process, although intuition is based on experience-dependent probabilistic models. Instead, we experience the intuitive process viscerally. Intuition operates largely in the social domain, can also be applied to purely physical situations. I have particularly in mind here the wonderful intuitions of someone like Richard Feynman, who thought intuitively about physical systems. Intuition is plastic. It is not instinct, although instinctive feelings may contribute to it. Emotional value judgments contribute to both intuition and to deliberation, which is a slower cognitive mechanism. So I don't want to make a distinction on the basis of one system being emotional and the other not. The emotion contributes to both. The main distinction I want to make is essentially between fast and slow. So we have this peculiar class of neurons, which I think are part of the circuitry for intuition, or for this fast form of intuition, which I think is something which may be a specialization in hominoids. And these peculiar neurons, the von Economo neurons or spindle cells, are located in the anterior cingulate cortex, which wraps around the anterior end of the corpus callosum in this medial view of the brain. Patrick Off and Esther Timchimsky began the modern study of these cells, although they were described in great detail by von Economo back in the 1920s. The other place where they're abundant is in frontal insular cortex, which is this wedge of tissue here that lies between the orbital frontal cortex and the insula. So I suggest that intuition is an important function of this system and of its mate on the medial side. And in contrast, we have dorsolateral prefrontal cortex more preferentially involved in the deliberative thought. Now, if you do a section through the brain, this kind of a section, a frontal section, you can see the location of frontal insular cortex and anterior cingulate cortex in this cross-sectional view. You notice the relative size of frontal insular cortex occupying a large part of the extent of orbital frontal cortex in this plane, contrasted with a very small area of frontal lower cortex in a chimpanzee. Now, the cells that I'm talking about are very large. Note the scale bar here is 50 microns. So this is a von Economo neuron. It can be several hundred microns in extent in terms of its cell body, and then it has an apical dendrite radiating out towards the peel surface and a basal dendrite going down towards the white matter. So this contrasts from the classical cells that we see in cortex, which are pyramidal neurons, which are pyramidal in shape, and that shape is imposed by the presence of an array of basal dendrites coming out of their base. And so I think that this population of cells are probably a specialization of pyramidal cells in which all of the growth has been concentrated in a single very large basal dendrite. So the point is that they're located in layer 5, which is a classic output layer of cortex. This implies that they're sending information out, processing out of the structure. They're very large, which is again associated with motor type neurons or with projection neurons. They have many other properties which suggest that they are projection neurons, and we know that they project into the white matter, but we don't know exactly where they go. So they're big neurons that we think are relaying information rapidly out of these two cortical areas in which they exist. They first appear, as far as we can tell from our comparative studies, we looked at about 25 species of primates, and they are not present except in gorillas, humans, bonobos, and common chimps. And from this, we make the inference that their time of origin was about 10 to 12 million years ago, roughly the time of the origin of the antecedents of African apes and humans. So they're a relatively recent specialization. So by comparison, I'll be talking about this in a few minutes, the evolution of bipedality, a characteristic of hominids, is perhaps 6-7 million years old. Now, the monoclonal neurons are a specialization that has arisen in the last 15 million years, and they have proliferated greatly within the human line of descent, and I'll show you that in a moment. Due to their late emergence in phylogeny, the force of natural selection has had only a relatively short time to shape their functioning and integration within neuronal circuits. Consequently, the von Conneville neurons may be particularly vulnerable to dysfunction in a manner analogous to the propensity of humans to suffer lower back, hip, and knee disorders as a consequence of the recent evolution of bipedal posture. So in other words, evolution works just well enough, but it's far from perfect. It has many defects. And some of just as there are defects in the recent evolution of bipedal posture that result in a host of miseries to the human condition and lead people to doctors very frequently, it's also possible that this system, which is both late in evolution and also, I'll show you in a minute, late in ontogeny as well, may be also particularly vulnerable to dysfunction and may conceivably have a role in a variety of neuropsychiatric disorders. I'll talk about one in particular, autism. So we've actually counted these neurons using stereologic sampling techniques in chimpanzees, gorillas, human newborns. This is a very late term, 42-week. This is the normal term infant, and this is a late term infant, a 7-month-old infant, a child of 4 years of age, and a number of adults. And so what you can see is that there are many more neurons in the adult humans than there are in adult gorillas or chimpanzees. So there are vastly more of them. The other thing that you can see is that there's a considerable increment in their number postnatally. Now, actually, because I've had access to the Alcott Brain Collection in Washington, which has 1,500 serially sectioned human brains, been able to explore this fairly carefully. But in the von Conneville cells first appear 35 weeks post-conception, rather abruptly. And that by birth, there are, say, on the order of 18,000 of them in this sample of 3 that we've looked at thus far. And the number appears to increment rapidly during the first couple of years of life. So they appear to definitely be coming in late relative to other neurons. Most neurons, of course, are formed midway through gestation. And so they're coming in late. We don't know whether they're migrating from postnatal neurogenesis and migrating to their location, or whether they're being transformed from some other cell type. That's something that we're working on, but we don't have an answer to that present. But what we do know is that the emergence as a distinctive morphological type is something that's coming into the first couple of years of life, postnatally. Now, in concert with that is an interesting observation that in the chimpanzees and the gorilla that we've looked at, and also in the adult humans and the 4-year-old child, what we've noticed is that there are 30% more neurons in the right hemisphere than the left hemisphere. And that's quite consistent. So we've seen that in every subject that we've seen beyond infancy. And so what's interesting is what happens in the course of infancy. So in the 38-week full-term baby, they're about the same number in the right and left hemispheres. And then that number increases during the first year of life. And then in the 7-month-old infant, we actually have a larger number, larger ratio, in other words, about a 2-to-1 ratio in the 7-month-old infant. What that implies is that the right hemisphere development races ahead of the left hemisphere, and the left hemisphere then gradually catches up with it. And so what this shows then is that this hemispheric preference, which is so strong in both apes and in older individual humans, that emerges as some sort of developmental process within the first couple of years of life. You're not born with it. And that means that it could be potentially impacted by a variety of events that occur during that period of life. The other thing, of course, is interesting to think about this is that this consistent preference of about 30% more neurons in the right hemisphere is probably associated with other systems that have to do with the experience and interpretation of emotion. Also, it suggests that hemispheric specialization is something that emerged in this system in apes long before the emergence of humans. Now, we know quite a bit about the chemistry of these cells, and I'm going to talk first about the dopamine receptor, which is very strongly expressed on these cells. This is the dopamine D3 receptor. It's one of 5 dopamine receptors. And this particular one, D3, is the high-affinity dopamine receptor. They're from D1 through D5. The D1 and the D5 are low-affinity receptors. So this is a receptor that has 100 to 1,000 times higher affinity for dopamine than the others. And it's very strongly expressed on the von Economo neurons. And this is a slide that Terry showed a few minutes ago. And the point I'm not going to go through all that, but just simply say that note this slide here. In a situation in which you present a stimulus that is known to be associated with a reward, then you get a volley of activity in the source populations for the dopamine input, which is the ventral tegmental area. So this is the activity of the cells which are projecting into this system. They're the source of the dopamine. Now, Wolfram Schultz did a really wonderful experiment. It's an extension of this, in which he signaled by different symbols the probability of reward, so that they range from probability of 0, probability of 0.5, up to a probability of 1. And so when you present a signal that indicates a probability of reward, you get, of course, an initial volley of activities, which is essentially what was shown in the previous figure. But in about a third of the neurons, you also see this ramping up of activity that precedes the receipt or non-receipt of the reward. This is associated with uncertainty. So this second signal that's being communicated by these neurons is one of this anticipation. The excitement mounts as you're waiting for whether or not you're going to receive the reward. And I think that this is a different kind of information. And because it is a relatively smaller signal, my conjecture is that is picked up by the higher affinity receptor. So this will be picked up by the low affinity receptor. And then this more subtle effect would be picked up by the high affinity receptor system. So it's interesting that Hugh Critchley, working completely independently, did an analogous experiment in humans in which he had a gambling task, in which the subjects are gambling for cash at a card game. And he varied the degree of uncertainty in that task, and he measured the activity in an fMRI study of anterior cingulate cortex and frontal insular cortex. Now, he didn't know anything about the von Economo cells when he did this. It's remarkable that it highlights the same structures. And the point being is that as you increase uncertainty in this task, you increase the level of activity during this period of expectation. It's the same phenomenon, in other words, that excitement mounts as you wait for whether you're going to get a reward or not. So uncertainty is a powerful determinant of the activity of this system. Now, John O'Doherty has done a very elegant series of experiments in which he did also a gambling task. And in this gambling task, you could make a wager, and you would either get a cash reward or a penalty according to the outcome of that wager. And then you could potentially change your wager to a different form of wager, a different kind of bet. And so if you just simply make your wager and receive a reward, that seems to be actually associated, the reward signal actually reduces activity. If you make a wager and receive a punishment, receive a penalty, that's also associated with a reduction in activity in both frontal insular cortex and anterior cingulate cortex, same places where the monocondymal cells live. If you make a wager, take a penalty for that wager, and then decide to switch to a different wager, that is associated with an increase in activity here. So it's like the adaptive decision-making process. Taking a hit, deciding to try something else. That's associated with specific activity of FI and ACC. Rebecca Elliott noticed in similar types of gambling experiments that area FI is active when the subjects report they have a sense that their luck is about to change. So there's a powerful association with reward and particularly the uncertain component of reward. Also, we have another neurotransmitter receptor which is strongly expressed on these cells, which is the serotonin 2B receptor. And the serotonin 2B receptor is very interesting because it is very rarely seen in the central nervous system. Instead, where it is seen is in the mesenteric nervous system, where it regulates gastric motility. And so it literally is visceral feeling. It's what's generating the differences in visceral feeling. And so this system, the strong expression of the serotonin 2B receptor on these cells strongly implicates these neurons in a relationship with the gut. And so the other thing that's interesting about this is Peter Dian, who Terry mentioned before, has a very interesting theory about serotonin that suggests that serotonin is dopamine's evil twin. That serotonin is the signal for expectation of punishment, potentially. And that links then to this function in the peripheral nervous system, in the mesenteric nervous system, which has to do with your gut churning, literally, which is a commonly used indication that you may get punished soon. Anyway, so that's a second system. So I'm suggesting that there's maybe something like a push-pull relationship between expectation of reward and expectation of punishment in this system, an integration of those two probabilities. Now, there is a third neurotransmitter receptor that's also strongly expressed on these cells, which is the vasopressin 1A. And from a beautiful series of experiments initially started by Sue Carter and then pursued by Tom Insel and Larry Young, have shown that vasopressin, and particularly the vasopressin 1A receptor, are necessary and sufficient for mediating the formation of social bonds. There are a beautiful series of experiments in rodents. So it's interesting that we find this also on these cells. And that suggests is that there's also a social affinity component to this process that's impinging on these cells. Now, we have some other interesting evidence for that. The one thing, I'll come to that in a second, but one point is that social situations which involve uncertainty, such as embarrassment and guilt and lying, all activate frontal insular cortex, rather specifically. Now, with respect then to the social bonds, we have this remarkable experiment by Bartels and Zeki, in which they did several different experiments in which subjects looked at loved ones, both lovers and also women looking at their children. both activate FI and ACC in the spindle cell containing areas. And FI, but not ACC, is also activated by the sounds of infants crying. So anyway, we have a whole variety of different things, and there are a great many more that I could mention, that implicate this structure in sort of the intuitive components of social interactions and also in uncertainty. And in contrast to this other system that I think is involved in deliberation. Now, I'd like to suggest that autism, or the whole class of disorders are called the autistic spectrum, may represent what it might be like to have this system not work so well. And so this comes from, when we interact with another person, we usually create a mental model of how that person thinks and feels. This model is a synthesis of our fast intuitions and our slower deliberations based on fact, logic, rules, etc. Describing subjects with Asperger's syndrome, Clinton Volkmar observed their deficient intuition and lack of spontaneous adaptation are accompanied by marked reliance on formalistic rules of behavior and rigid social conventions. Our hypothesis is that the bonacama neurons are an important part of the circuitry responsible for intuition, and that these neurons are dysfunctional in autism spectrum disorders, resulting in defective intuition. Or putting it a different way, they have to rely much more heavily on the deliberative process. And this is sort of revealed, I think, in a wonderful statement by a very high-functioning autistic individual, Campbell Grandin, who said, "Each day I collect more data to place in my library of experience. When I encounter a new social situation, I have to search my memory for a similar experience that I can use as a model for my next action. I have a very difficult time when I'm confronted with unexpected social surprises. For common social interactions with clients, I use pre-programmed, pre-rehearsed logics, pre-rehearsed responses. Everything is done with logic. So this is the deliberative system. And a high-functioning individual, that's what they have to work with. So Clinton and Volkmar point out individuals with Asperger's, which is a form of autism, typically cannot avail themselves of their formal social knowledge in a quick pace, simultaneously shifting social situations. They often miss the tempo of interactions and lose any possibility of rapidly adjusting themselves to the forever shifting social and community demands of others. In other words, speed is important and rapid adjustment to changing contingencies. This is notably true for social situations, but it's not restricted necessarily to social situations. So Asperger himself actually commented on another thing, which is related to this. Another characteristic of autistic children is the absence of a sense of humor. Autistic children are rarely relaxed and carefree and never achieve that peculiar wisdom of deep, intuitive human understanding that underlies genuine humor. So I was inspired by this to actually look at humor. And so we took 50 cartoons from the Far Side, New Yorker, and we dehumorized them by deleting little things such as, yes, we're open to the vulture side here. And so then we put subjects in the scanners. So we had 100 cartoons, half of which are dehumorized. And then we asked the subjects while in the scanner to rate how funny they thought the cartoons were. And specifically, area FI is activated in proportion to how funny they think their humor is. So that is pretty clear linkage. Now, there are a number of other linkages. I just alluded to humor. I also like to say one more thing about humor, and that is that Freud actually suggested that humor is a way of relieving tension. And I think that may be an essential for the functioning of the intuitive system, to periodically recalibrate it. Or else you would build up a series of things that would be malfunctioning. Anyway, so humor activates both FI and ACC. It's certainly abnormal in autism. Social bonding activates FI and ACC. It's decreased or abnormal in autism. Empathy activates ACC and FI from studies by Tanya Singer and her colleagues. That is said to be decreased or certainly abnormal in autism. Trust is also from a study by Tanya Singer, activates FI, but apparently not ACC. And curiously, Ralph Adolph showed that trust is increased because of difficulty reading social cues in autistic subjects. Finally, Baron Cohen showed that discrimination of mental states of others activates both FI and ACC, and it's decreased in autism. So there are quite a few more I could add to this chart, but it's I think, pretty massive evidence. Now, then I'm just showing this just to remind you of where FI is located, a normal subject. And what we've done now is we've looked at two autistic children, an autistic boy and an autistic girl who are 9 years of age each. And we've looked at where the von Economou cells are. We saw something that was rather surprising to me. Now, note this is where it is normally. And this shows a plotting of actually each individual cell. And it's located more medially than normal in these individuals. And it's also the cells are normally located in layer 5. So what you would see in a normal individual is a band of cells here in the gray matter. But instead what you see them is heavily in the white matter. And you see rather large concentrations of them. You see more of them in the autistic subjects, but they're in the wrong place. And that suggests to me that there's some sort of a defect, whatever it is in their migration or in their differentiation that occurs in the first few years of life, that is not occurring normally in these individuals. And that for whatever reason, they're ending up in these clumps, so that this actually, when you look at it in a microscope, it looks like a log jam of von Economou cells that have all sort of backed up behind some invisible barrier. Anyway, so von Economou neurons may relay a fast, intuitive assessment of complex social situations to facilitate the rapid adjustment of behavior in quickly changing social situations. Thus, they may be a neuronal specialization linked to the increased complexity of hominoid and especially human social interactions. We hypothesize that these specializations enable us to reduce complex social and cultural dimensions of decision-making into a single dimension that facilitates the rapid execution of decisions. Other animals are not encumbered by such elaborate social and cultural contingencies to the decision-making and thus do not require such a system for rapid intuitive choice, at least at such a level of complexity. Because of their late emergence in phylogeny and ontogeny, the von Economou neurons may be particularly vulnerable to dysfunction. Now, finally, why would natural selection favor the evolution of neural circuitry responsible for embarrassment, guilt, empathy, and cooperation? The rational choice economists would sort of deny that this is even important. So Robert Frank, who is himself an economist, wrote a wonderful book called Passions Within Reason, the Strategic Role for the Emotions. And he points out there the moral sentiments, the things I just talked about, may be viewed as a crude attempt to fine-tune the reward mechanism, i.e. dopamine, to make it more sensitive to distant rewards and penalties. In other words, by distant, he means distant in time. So that situations in which an individual would forego a reward in the interest of long-term maintenance of a relationship or would accept a penalty in the interest of maintaining a relationship. But the important issue is distant in time, not immediate reward, foregoing that immediate thing. I think it's a really central insight. And so apes and humans are long-lived and their offspring mature slowly. Therefore, the future is important. The prospects for future success depend on mutually beneficial associations, reciprocal altruism. And this network of cooperative relationships constitutes an individual's social capital. And I would maintain that that's the foundation of financial capital as well. And to establish an effective social network, one must have some way to determine who will be a faithful partner in future interactions. That's the crucial problem that you have to figure out. And that's done both through deliberation and through intuition. Such determinations arise in part from one's intuitive assessment. The likelihood of potential partners will be empathic to your misfortunes, will be deterred from defaulting on obligations to you by feelings of guilt. Hard to do. Maybe we do just a little bit better than chance, but well enough. So I'm going to leave you with that. Yeah.
Thanks. Thanks. Good job.
The work of Terry and John and our next speaker, Paul Zach, helped me answer the question, indirectly anyway, why should you be good without God? If there's no God, why should you be moral? What's the ultimate basis for it? And in a way, the answer coming here is that because it's built into us. It's hardwired into us. It's in our brain. We're rewarded for doing these kinds of good things. It's also, yes, because we have a social contract and all those political social reasons, but what we're getting at here is something much deeper, which then gets us to the problem of, if there's no God, what's the absolute, Archimedean point from which we can look down and determine good and right and wrong, good and evil, and so on. Isn't there some outside source? Well, in a way, evolution has given us that sort of sense of transcendency. And Paul Zak's work I read because he not only does the brain stuff about neurochemistry, oxytocin, and trust, but also looks at social and political conditions and how a country can structure its social system that would generate more trust or less trust, that kind of thing. Dr. Zak is at the Center of Neuroeconomics at Claremont Graduate University, where I got my degree too, so fellow alum here, where he conducts research on the neurobiology of trust, the neural substrates of reward valuation, and the relationship of touch and trust, social cognition producing cooperation or conflict, decision-making under uncertainty, the neural foundation of human capital, the effect of institutional design on economic development, and the link between economic systems, social systems, and trust. Dr. Paul Zak.
Well, it's a wonderful group here. I'm glad to see so many people have shown up. You probably brought, a friend or a family member with you, but mostly you're sitting next to strangers. Make anybody uncomfortable? If it makes you uncomfortable, you can't raise your hand because then people would know. Okay. This is we had one hand. This is very unusual. That's right. If you look around, people don't look stressed out here. We seem very comfortable around many people with whom we're not acquainted. We're not closely genetically related to most of these people, yet we're not stressed. If I took a room full of rats and did the same thing, fur would fly, right? And blood. Okay, how do we do this? How do we figure out that it's okay to sit next to Susan, but Michael, he's a sketchy guy. I don't want to sit too close to him. Something's going to happen. I don't know what it is. I got a bad feeling about it. This is something we've been studying for a number of years. There's kind of two ways we can approach this problem. One is the sort of James Madison approach, which is, you know what, people are bad. I don't want to be too careful. I want to be very careful. I want to make sure that I kind of distrust people because my sort of view of human nature is that given a chance, people would cheat me. Or this sort of a Tennessee Williams approach, which is we're always depending on the kindness of strangers. Right? I was in France last week, and my French is terrible. And I asked thousands of people in bad French, where's the bus? Where do I go? Help me to the plane. And people, by and large, were extraordinarily nice. Why would they do that? I mean, from a sort of purely survival of the fittest evolutionary perspective, these people are burning energy and time to help me, and they share almost no genes with me. So in a close sense, they share lots of genes with me in sort of the human sense, but I'm not in their immediate family or even distant family. Right? I'm probably not related to them closely at all. Why would you do such a thing? I think those two questions, how we can sit next to strangers, in fact, how we like to be with strangers. Many humans actually move to big cities and say it's enjoyable and exciting. It's electric to be in New York City. Right? We're not hermits. So if we look at cross-country data, this is the proportion of people who said people in their country are very or mostly trustworthy. Look at the top left-hand corner, you see Norway, Sweden, Denmark, the Netherlands, Canada, right? Almost 2/3 of the people in Norway say people in my country are trustworthy. Okay? US is in the middle, around 45%. This is a mid-90s data. On the bottom right-hand corner, you see 3% of Brazilians say people are trustworthy. Up from that, Peru, Philippines, Turkey, Colombia, Venezuela. Okay, so if you drop your wallet in Lima or in Rio de Janeiro, it's not going to be returned. And if you drop your wallet in Oslo, chances are very high that someone will return that wallet. And again, if you think about what drives these kinds of behaviors, the environment in which you're interacting in Lima versus Oslo is much different. Some work published a couple years ago identified the kind of environments that promote high levels of trust or low levels of trust. And this includes the social environment, economic environment, legal environment, and political environments. And when we did this, we showed that trust is among the most powerful factors economists have ever found to explain why countries are poor. Poor countries are by and large low trust countries. Why is that? Because the kinds of transactions that are necessary to generate increasing wealth or increasing standards of living occur over time. I need to make an investment in a new business, and I need to hire people. I need all those things to happen without having someone steal all my capital, without having the government appropriate my business, right? Those things occur over time. So in environments in which trust is high, in which contracts are enforced, those investments are greater, and therefore the creation of wealth is greater and living standards are higher. Okay, so this is big news. All of a sudden we discovered this big gun to alleviate poverty. I'm getting calls. I go to the World Bank. This is great. So I write one paper. I'm this big expert on trust. Wonderful. But I have this nagging feeling in the back of my head when I give these talks that I've really missed a big part of the question. And the big question is not necessarily, I think this is a big question. How do I design environments across countries or across communities to generate higher trust and therefore greater vision in what's going to happen in the future and the ability for people to take risks and, in fact, generate wealth? That's great. That's big news. But playing the role of the trust expert, I left out this other kind of nagging big question, which is, for a fixed environment, how do two people decide to trust each other? Right? Why do you think that the person sitting next to you today, I don't know, does not have a bad intention, is not going to hurt you, is not going to rob you? How do you make that determination? And if you talk to people kind of casually, they seem to make this determination very quickly. So I go to a cocktail party, I don't know very many people, I meet someone for the first time, and right away I have this sort of intuition like, wow, great person. I really enjoyed meeting this person. I don't know, we kind of hit it off. Or another person, maybe Michael, scary guy, I don't know what it is, he's kind of driving me nuts. I can't put my finger on it, I can't tell you about it. John Allman would say, I had this intuition for these particular social interactions, and then intuition informed me that, I don't know, Michael's a sketchy guy. Okay, so how do we start to study this? Right? If we're going to design these environments, it actually would be nice to know the physiologic mechanisms that allow us to have this sort of conditional psychology of trust. Right? If I go into this room and I see these individuals, I have to pretty quickly know, okay, here's a person I can trust, here's a person I can't. If I don't have that quick and perhaps dirty, fast intuition on what's going to happen, potentially my survival's at stake. Okay, so and humans seem to do this much more than other animals. So the first thing you want to do is put some kids in a laboratory and just have them make these decisions and ask them what happened. How did you make this decision? It turns out that people have a hard time articulating why they trust somebody and why they're trustworthy. Because now I have a further problem, which is, if I just have this sort of simplistic model, this kind of very rational model, people go in, they decide, this person I'm going to trust, this person I'm not going to. My job's done. Then I can just tell you, well, people trust because of, I don't know, blonde hair and brown shoes and whatever. Right? These are things that determine trust or not. Not that these intuitions aren't important, these kind of physical characteristics. If I take that away, remove the personal, you're interacting with a person but you can't see them, you can't talk to them, why would you still trust them? Oh, and also, you only get to interact with them once, and I'll put some money on the table. So you guys can, if you can figure out how to trust each other, you can take some money home with you. Okay, that's what I'm going to investigate. In fact, humans have a very strong desire to interact socially. And this begins with the first intimate relationship in your life. That's with your mother. Right? And there's a large literature in looking at non-human mammals that suggests that they are mechanisms through which mother-to-infant bonding occurs, and in some species, long-term pair bonds among adults also occurs. And so I hypothesized that this particular neuroactive hormone called oxytocin, which is associated with prosocial behaviors in non-human animals, might also work in humans. So we designed an experiment. And I'm going to tell you about that experiment in just a moment. And we mentioned that oxytocin is a very simple molecule. It's made up of 9 amino acids. It is medically uninteresting, which is why I think it was unstudied in humans before I began doing this work. Unless you're a human female who's giving birth or breastfeeding, oxytocin is irrelevant to your life. So we thought. We wondered if there was a behavioral effect of oxytocin. And lastly, I should say that, very consistent with John's talk, people are not kind of open to conscious awareness in how they make these determinations of who they think will be trustworthy and who isn't. And we find masses of oxytocin receptors in humans in old areas of the brain, phylogenetically old areas of the brain, particularly the amygdala and the hypothalamus. So if this is a story about oxytocin, and guess what it is, because I'm here, then this sort of explains why we do this intuitively, right? This is not something that's kind of higher cortical activity. I'm not doing a cost-benefit analysis. I'm doing this very fast, emotional, intuitive determination of who I should be interacting with and who I shouldn't. Okay, so the first question is, how can I measure trust in a laboratory setting? So some clever experimental economists out of Vernon Smith's lab set up a kind of interesting social dilemma, which I will present to you in a moment, in which you can measure both trust and trustworthiness. And as I said, we put a little money on the table so that we invest these decisions with weight. If I just ask you randomly, oh, do you trust people? Oh, sure I do, of course. But now, if you can't communicate with someone and you've got cash sitting there and, it might be, for undergraduates, a reasonably large amount of cash, how might I do that? Okay, so the money here is important only to make the decisions important to the individuals. It's not, I think, inherently interesting itself. Okay, so here's a social dilemma. We recruit a bunch of kids for this experiment. They all receive $10 for showing up. They're instructing the experiment. There's no deception. And I'll show you the laboratory in a minute. And they can't talk to each other, but they're randomly assigned by computer to pairs. And they're instructed in this task, which is you're randomly matched within your pair. You're randomly determined to be either decision maker 1 or decision maker 2. And decision maker 1 will be prompted by computer software to see if he or she would like to send some portion of his or her $10 show-up fee to someone else they've been paired with in a lab. And the other person they're paired with, the decision maker 2, knows that whatever is sent to them comes out of decision maker 1's account and is tripled in decision maker 2's account. So if I'm decision maker 1 and I said, well, I think I'll send, 8 of my $10 show-up fee, I keep 2, and the person I've paired with gets 24, plus the 10 they got for showing up, they have $34. Then at some point, decision maker 2 will be given the information about how much decision maker 1 was sent to them, and will be prompted to send some amount back to them, but they don't have to. You only do it once, and there's no one looking over your shoulder. It's a so-called double-blind experiment. So your identity is masked from the other individuals as well as from the experimenters. I don't know what you're doing. No one else knows what you're doing. So just think about that for a second. You're in the lab, and I'll show you a picture. You have computer stations. You have partitions around you. You can't see anybody else. What do you do with your $10? So this has been run literally hundreds of times around the world, by the way, also for much larger stakes. And the transfer from decision maker 1 to decision maker 2 is commonly viewed as a measure of trust. Right? If I take money out of my account and triple it in your account, I'm saying, hey, these Yahoo experimenters are going to make the pie a lot bigger. Let's go with this. Let's try to leave here with some cash. And you're expecting decision maker 2 to figure it out. Like, I took money out of, I sacrificed to send you a bunch of cash. Now do what you're supposed to do, which is share it. Okay? The problem is, it's a one-shot interaction. If decision maker 2 decides to keep everything, there's nothing you can do about it. Okay? So what do people do? In general, most decision maker 1 sent a fair amount of cash. The average is around $5, and decision maker 2s tend to return about half of what they're sent. It's always better to be decision maker 2 in this task. You make more money. So in our experiments, decision maker 1s, on average, leave the lab with $14, and decision maker 2s, on average, leave the lab with $17. So somehow, lacking communication, just sending this trust signal, they have kind of induced a social obligation to play nice. Okay? Now the question is, what drives this? The sort of standard model in economics, as Professor Allman suggested, is I should never trust anybody. I should never leave money on the table. So the so-called Nash equilibrium, this is can be written down as a game, a strategic interaction. The Nash equilibrium is to send 0. And the logic here is if I'm decision maker 2, what's better, more money or less money? Well, more money, right? So I should keep everything. Therefore, if I'm decision maker 1, I should send 0. So the prediction from standard economics is $10 for everybody. But in fact, my subjects make a lot more than $10. So that clearly that equilibrium notion is wrong because people are making more money on average. Why is it wrong? And why can't you just tell me why you're doing what you're doing? So in my experiments, subjects are informed that the $10 they're being paid to show up not only compensates for their time, up to an hour and a half in the lab, it's literally blood money. I'm going to take 4 tubes of blood from their arm when they make a decision. Okay? Again, one-shot interaction, no deception. You can't communicate with other people. And we time the sessions to all start in the early afternoon, which is the trough of the diurnal variation of hormones. So the difference between the first subject and the last subject is minimized. And we run 2 conditions, the standard trust social dilemma that I just explained to you, and then a control condition in which I'm going to have the same transfer from DM1 to DM2 absent a social intention. And how do I do that? I'm going to use a very expensive piece of laboratory equipment, which I built at Walmart for $10. I took a plastic container and I covered it with duct tape, and I put in 11 ping pong balls numbered 0 to 10. And I had the DM1s publicly pull a ping pong ball out, and that amount of money was taken out of their account and tripled in their player 2's account. And it was done publicly. I shake it up. It's noisy, so everybody knows that there was no intention on decision maker 1's account. So the question here is this a social interaction, right? If it's social, if it's not just a money issue, if it's social, then it should activate, or we hypothesize this will activate the release of oxytocin. If it's just cash, then you're just, you're responding to getting cash. So we're going to control for that. This is the lab we ran it at. This is at UCLA. It's a large lab. There are 67 stations. We run between 16 and 20 subjects, so no one is sat next to each other. They're spread out in the lab, and you can see there are partitions that are pulled out around each subject. So there's a large degree and expectation of privacy. Okay, so you make your decision sequentially. I'll call it your identity masking code. You make a decision. You type in the computer. When you're done, you raise your hand. We take you to a back room, and we draw 4 tubes of blood from your arm. Here's an actual subject and my collaborators getting blood from a subject. Why? Because oxytocin can be measured peripherally in blood. It's not stable in other bodily fluids. Once we get that blood, it immediately goes on ice. We want to have the decision and the signal be as close in time as possible and not have it degrade. Oxytocin degrades fairly rapidly at room temperature. Once they're put on ice and all the blood has been drawn from subjects, we centrifuge these. We separate out blood, serum, and plasma. And these are put into little microtubes and stored on dry ice and then transferred to a minus 70 centigrade freezer until they're ready for analysis. So the point here is we're trying to preserve the signal as much as possible. Oxytocin levels are basically 0 in your body, again, absent giving birth or breastfeeding. So if there's a surge of oxytocin, we've got to get it and preserve it. And what do we find? Indeed, we find that individuals who received a signal of trust had a surge in oxytocin, roughly twice the oxytocin levels in their blood as those who received the same average amount of money absent a social intention. Okay, so receiving this signal of trust, this monetary transfer denoting this social intention, provokes the release of oxytocin. And indeed, we find that higher oxytocin levels are statistically associated with greater trustworthiness. That is, a decision maker 2s more likely return money to decision maker 1s when they had higher oxytocin on board. With one exception. And I should mention that's my little daughter. We had a wonderful natural experiment. Right, this could be noise. And we measured 10 other hormones, lots of interactions. These are reproductive hormones. So oxytocin interacts with estradiol and testosterone and cortisol. We measured all those things, and all the effects we can find are through oxytocin. But there's this wonderful natural experiment, which is some women in our experiment were ovulating. And when is ovulation? How do we know it's ovulation? There's a spike in progesterone. By the way, progesterone also spikes during pregnancy. Because we had blood, we ruled out that any of our subjects were pregnant. They were not. So we had women who were ovulating, And progesterone is known to inhibit the uptake of oxytocin by its receptor. And guess what? These women had the same surge in oxytocin, but their behavior was different. They were less trustworthy. Okay. Why is that? One evolutionary story is that progesterone puts a brake on the desire for, if you will, social intercourse, because if social intercourse leads to actual intercourse, there's a high metabolic cost if you take that decision too lightly. So we looked for that interrupter, and in fact we found it. So this suggests to us that this is a direct effect of oxytocin on behavior and not an indirect effect. Okay, and lastly we see that when there's a trust signal, DM2s return 54% of what they're sent, and when the transfer of money is done through a ping pong ball draw, they only return 18%. So very high correlation between what you're sent and what you return when oxytocin is high. Okay, here's actually a scatter plot of the data. So we see trustworthiness, that is the back transfer from DM2 to DM1, and oxytocin levels. And you can see that there roughly is a sort of strong positive relationship, except I have these 5 dots circled in red who are a little bit special. They had this big oxytocin surge, but they didn't return very much money. So there's a technical term for these guys in the trade. They're called bastards. Right? So someone sacrificed $9, $10, $11, $9, $10, $8 of their show-up fee, sent to these guys, they got tripled, they had $30 or $40 sitting around, and they chose to return 0 or almost 0. Who are these guys? And what's the source of their behavior? Well, we had a very extensive social survey, so we asked some questions. And remember, these are all reproductive hormones, so nature is a very conservative system. It's going to hijack the same mechanisms for many uses. And so we asked a lot of questions about reproductive behaviors. What we find is that these interesting, nice folks are emotionally labile. They are much more active sexually than the rest of the group. They believe it's okay to accumulate wealth while others live in poverty. They believe others are trustworthy, and they themselves are very trustworthy. This was done before they actually did the experiment. So what it looks like is that for most people, the hormone, the surge in oxytocin, explains the bulk of the variation in the data. But for people in the tailored distribution, it seems like personality traits matter more. And currently, we're looking into these sort of personality traits by looking at a number of pathological populations. So we don't have a full story on were these guys dropped on their heads, or they just had a bad genetic draw, or maybe they had a bad day. Come back in 2 years and I'll report to you. Lastly, this is all correlational data. So in a paper that will appear next month in Nature, we gave 128 men either synthetic oxytocin via an inhaler or placebo, blinded. And what we want to do here is to demonstrate causation. I want to show that it actually can induce changes in your behavior by giving you the hormone. And it turns out we can. So in the DM1s in the oxytocin group, 45% showed the maximal trust levels versus 21% in the placebo group, and the average amount that they trusted others was much higher. And this graph shows some of the data for that. So it looks like I can, in fact, utilize this hormone to reduce your social fear of interacting with others and motivate you to take this risk. So it doesn't seem that people on oxytocin have better mood. It's not that you have a belief that DM2s are going to return more money to you. It seems to reduce the sort of anxiety we have with interacting with someone who we haven't seen before. So it does motivate kind of positive social behaviors. And it's interesting, as I said, the people who kind of followed their body and their brain's guide to trust and be trustworthy, in fact, made more money than the people who played the Nash equilibrium. So I think in many senses, if we just listen to our intuition, if we listen to what our body's telling us to do, then we're reaching a socially desirable outcome, which is very interesting. And the implications of that, as Michael suggested, are profound. So it doesn't happen all the time, and there certainly are bastards out there, but on average, most of the time, when you trust someone, they're trustworthy. And lastly, I should say that when we give subjects oxytocin exogenously, we don't affect the behavior of DM2s. Why is that? If you already have, because most people DM2s are getting a big surge of oxytocin anyway, because almost everybody trusts each other. So those receptors are mostly bound up. So if I exogenously increase your oxytocin levels, it has no behavioral or biological effect because those receptors are bound. Okay, so the whole story seems to hold together. Okay, and lastly, we looked at distrust. So we thought, if social behaviors of this sort are an important biologic system, most important systems have more than one driver. There's two sides of control. For example, think of hunger. We're getting late in the day now. Your stomach may be grumbling. It may be signaling to you that it's time to eat, and that's controlled by a hormone called ghrelin, and there's another hormone called leptin that when you've eaten enough, tells you to stop feeding, okay, that most of us listen to. So there's two sides of control because it's very important, feeding is a very important behavior. We think social behaviors are very important. Maybe there's two sides to this. Maybe there's this oxytocin side in which we're motivated to be trustworthy physiologically. What about distrust? What about when we get the signal of distrust as a DM2? In a study of around 200 subjects, we found is that when men receive a signal of distrust, and distrust here is, I'm a DM2 and I was sent very little. So I don't know who this person is. I matched with someone randomly in the lab, but they just didn't trust me. They sent me $0 or $1. They blew it, right? They had a chance to walk away with a big chunk of money, and they just didn't do it. Men had a proportional rise in a hormone called dihydrotestosterone. DHT is sort of, I think I have a slide on this. What happened to that? DHT is sort of high octane, this slide's missing. DHT is high octane testosterone. Testosterone is mostly protein bound, so it's inactive. DHT is a thing that causes, the hormone that causes virilization in men during puberty. It causes hair maturation. Any of the guys with male pattern baldness, you are alpha males. You have high levels of DHT because too much DHT causes your hair to fall out, and just the right amount causes your hair to mature properly. It is available both in men and women, although men have a higher average level. So we find in men is that the less you're sent as a DM2, the more you have a surge in DHT. You have this kind of aggressive response, so you don't like it. You blew it, pal. Go outside and let's mix it up. Women, much cooler physiologically. And again, we're measuring a whole suite of hormones here. Women report that they don't like being distrusted, but they don't have this strong physiologic response. Okay. And lastly, we are doing many more studies now looking at functional MRI and giving folks different kinds of drugs and determining causally how these neuroactive hormones affect behaviors. But in short, I think this is an important new finding that suggests that oxytocin is a guide to weaving our way through this complicated social environment that humans live in. And it helps us have this quick and intuitive sense of who to trust and who not to trust. And I'll end with a English proverb. It's an equal failing to trust everybody and to trust nobody. Thank you very much.
Perfect. That's great.
Thank you very much.
That was so interesting. Trust with verification because of those bastards. Paul, it's the shoes. You wouldn't trust anybody with those shoes, right? Is that what you were getting at? When I was in graduate school the first time, I was in a master's program in experimental psychology at Cal State Fullerton, and I was in a behavior lab, a Skinnerian lab, a lab with rats that press bars and pigeons that peck keys, and humans that press bars. And then after I left that to do bike racing stuff, I kind of lost track of what happened to the behaviorists movement and behaviorism and so forth. And so we've done a number of pieces over the years in Skeptic, and so I thought when sort of on evolutionary psych and behaviorism and whatnot, I thought if we're going to study this problem from all these different aspects that we've been covering from all angles today, I thought we should have a behavioral aspect, a Skinnerian behaviorist, and Hank Schlinger is that man. He is a professor in the Department of Psychology at Cal State University, Northridge. He received his PhD in psychology from Western Michigan University, where he also completed a postdoc in behavioral pharmacology. He's authored 3 books: Psychology, A Behavioral Overview, A Behavior Analytic View of Child Development, and Introduction to Scientific Psychology. That you shouldn't have to use both of those names. They should be just one, but that's part of the problem with psychology, I think. In addition to behavioral pharmacology, he's published research on and basic learning processes in humans and non-humans. And he's done a number of pieces for Skeptic. He's got another one coming out. Actually, it'll be similar to the talk here today, in which he's looking at consciousness from a rather different perspective. With that, Dr. Hank Schlinger.
Thank you very much. First, I want to thank Michael for inviting me to participate in this conference. I also want to thank Paul for confirming something that I've known for a long time, that I am an alpha male. As Michael indicated, well, I'm not sure he indicated this, but the title of my talk is Consciousness is Nothing But a Word. Before I begin, I'd like to just clarify what we mean by nothing. An indefinite pronoun indicating that there is not anything, not a single thing, or not a single part of a thing, used to indicate the complete lack of the quality mentioned in somebody or something, a zero quantity or zero, and finally a state of non-existence or the absence of any perceptible qualities. Consciousness is nothing but a word. In 1991, Daniel Dennett wrote a book titled Consciousness Explained. 10 years later, in 2001, he penned an article titled, Are We Explaining Consciousness Yet? If he had to ask the question, the answer is obvious. 4 years later, here we are, still trying to explain it. English-speaking philosophers and psychologists have been trying to understand consciousness at least since John Locke introduced the word into the English language in the 17th century. And despite the best efforts of those who've thrown their hats into the ring, we haven't made much progress. Obviously, we need a different approach. For the past decade or so, many have argued that the brain gives rise to consciousness. Some have set their sights on finding its so-called neural correlates, trying to explain consciousness, as the late Sir Francis Crick described it, in terms of the interactions of nerve cells and the molecules associated with them. Referring to consciousness as the major unsolved problem in biology, Crick stated that you, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. But these things are more than the behavior of your nerve cells, just as a Seurat painting is more than the 1,000 points of paint on the canvas. They're also your behavior and the activity of your peripheral nervous system, all in a rich context. But Crick is obviously not alone in believing that reductionism will solve the riddle of consciousness. And sexy, sophisticated technologies seem to offer hope for such beliefs. I, for one, am skeptical. And here's why. First, before we search for the neural correlates of consciousness, we need an overarching theory of behavioral causation within which to understand human behavior, including consciousness. Then we need to know what consciousness is and how and why we become conscious. Even then, consciousness will not be found in the brain. No behavior will be. Knowing how the plumbing works, in other words, the proximate neural causes of behavior, is not enough. In the quest to understand consciousness, the work of neuroscientists will indeed be important, but it will only be a piece of the larger scientific puzzle. Neuroreductionism alone is not the answer to the puzzle of consciousness or any behavioral phenomenon. To put it rather bluntly, we can understand consciousness at its most important level without any knowledge of neural correlates. That's not to say that such knowledge won't clarify the brain's role in mediating behaviors that we call consciousness, but the ultimate explanations are to be found in the evolutionary and individual learning histories that shape the actual behaviors that we refer to as consciousness, not in the brain. And those explanations will come from evolutionary biology and learning science. But we won't even get that far as long as we continue to talk about consciousness in such unscientific, metaphorical ways. Consider, for example, the following summary of a recent book on consciousness. And I didn't make this up. Through this analysis, the first and most obvious observation is that consciousness appears as a volumetric spatial void containing colored objects and surfaces. This reveals that the representation in the brain takes the form of an explicit volumetric spatial model of external reality. Therefore, the world we see around us is not the real world itself, but merely a miniature virtual reality replica of that world in an internal representation. Whew. No wonder Daniel Dennett said, with consciousness, we are still in a terrible muddle. Consciousness is not a place or a thing or a mental or cognitive process, whatever those are. It's only a word that we use in a variety of ways. For example, we can say that an organism is conscious if it's awake and or alert versus asleep or in a coma. We can then study the behaviors associated with wakefulness and the underlying neural structures that mediate them. Crick and Koch use consciousness to refer to visual perception, which is an acceptable strategy as long as it points to actual behaviors involved in perceiving and their ultimate evolutionary and learned causes. But most discussions of consciousness are muddled because what people talk about is subjective experience, or so-called qualia, such as the redness of red. But what does that mean, the redness of red? Newborns come equipped with specialized receptors that respond to the wavelength of light corresponding to red, but they don't yet respond differently to red than to other colors, and thus don't experience the redness of red. Humans alone learn the concept of red because we alone learn one response to all things that reflect that particular wavelength, even if they differ in all other respects. That one response is the word red. We're taught to say red by others who reinforce the response only in the presence of red things. Other animals learn to respond to specific red things, such as a red fruit, but only humans respond solely to redness. Physicists can explain the nature of the wavelengths corresponding to red, and neurophysiologists can explain the biochemical changes that occur when those wavelengths strike photoreceptors. But we need behavioral psychologists to tell us how someone learns to perceive and thus be conscious of redness. So to answer the question, what's it like to be a newborn? Nothing. There is no conscious experience. There are no qualia, not yet. Seems like a good place to take a sip of water. Discussions of qualia are muddled because the definition is vague and subjective. Of course, qualia, like consciousness, is just a word. As psychologist Noel Smith has noted, the concept of consciousness is a construct, an invention, an abstraction, a contrivance. But it's an unsatisfactory construct in that it has no specifiable reference. There are no real events that comprise it, and thus no agreement about what it is and how it operates. According to Smith, it's only a tangle of words because it consists of no more than words. Thus, those searching for qualia or consciousness may as well be hunting for Lewis Carroll's snark. So, will we ever be able to solve the problem of consciousness? David Chalmers believes that while the ultimate answer will come from cognitive neuroscience, we're still a long way from that answer. According to Chalmers, consciousness is the biggest mystery. It may be the largest outstanding obstacle in our quest for a scientific understanding of the universe. The science of physics is not yet complete, but it is well understood. The science of biology has removed many ancient mysteries surrounding the nature of life. Even in the science of the mind, much progress has been made. Recent work in cognitive neuroscience is leading us to a better understanding of human behavior and of the processes that drive it. We do not have many detailed theories of cognition, to be sure, but the details cannot be too far off. Consciousness, however, is as perplexing as it ever was. It still seems utterly mysterious that the causation of behavior should be accompanied by a conscious inner life. We do not just lack a detailed theory, we are entirely in the dark about how consciousness fits into the natural order." Unquote. Well, whether or not consciousness is the biggest unsolved mystery in the universe, I don't think a science of the mind has produced much progress towards understanding it. In fact, there can be no science of the mind, because science deals with real observed events, and the mind is not real and can never be observed. That's why there are no detailed theories of cognition. To solve the two problems I've just outlined, the disproportionate emphasis on neuroreductionism without an overarching theory of ultimate behavioral causation, and our non-scientific descriptions of consciousness, a fresh approach is required. And that's what I hope to outline in my talk today. First, remember that no matter how puzzling consciousness appears to be, it happens in biological organisms, humans. And thus the solution requires an approach that draws upon the natural sciences of evolutionary biology, behavioral psychology, and neuroscience, in that order. The title of this conference contains the two muddiest terms in psychology, mind and consciousness. No offense, Michael. It's important to understand how we use a term before we attempt a scientific analysis of the behaviors that the term denotes. That analysis then needs to derive from experimentally established principles and not philosophical speculation. I'll make the simple but probably contentious point that what we speak of as consciousness is only behavior. There are no ghosts in the machine. Before turning my attention to consciousness, however, I'd like to comment briefly on the terms brain and mind, also in the conference title. First, brain. There's no question that in one sense the brain causes everything we do. But that raises the bigger and more ultimate question about behavioral causation. What causes the brain to cause behavior? In light of that question, let me repeat that we will not completely understand consciousness or any behavioral phenomenon, no matter how much we learn about the brain. And we won't completely understand the brain's role, without a cogent theory of behavioral causation. We must understand not just how the brain is structured or what part of the brain correlates with some activity, but why the brain is constructed the way it is and how it came to be that way. To answer those questions, we must turn to evolutionary biology to understand the evolutionary history of the species, and more importantly, in my view, to behavioral psychology to understand the individual's learning history. We must bring learning science into the picture if we are ever to make real headway in our understanding of the complex human behaviors made possible by the brain. Now to the word mind. In the upcoming article in Skeptic that Michael mentioned, titled How the Human Got Its Mind, Debunking the Last Great Myth in Psychology, I argue that mind, like consciousness, is just a word without a physical referent. As with other terms in the history of science, for example, ether, phlogiston, language acquisition device, that have been made up to explain the unexplainable, we invented the word mind to explain our own behavior. Unfortunately, along the way, we reified it. The mind was said to explain everything we did, and it could do so safely from its eternal hiding place, where it could also assume any qualities we wanted to give it. And just as with consciousness, literary descriptions of the mind abound. For example, the noted anthropologist Richard Leakey wrote that the mind is a channel for reaching worlds beyond the material objects of everyday life through imagination, and it offers us a means of bringing abstract worlds into technicolor reality, unquote. Beautiful. In my article, I argue that no other natural science still adheres to such antiquated, unscientific concepts that are relics from centuries of religious and philosophical speculation. I conclude that there is no mind other than the word, and that the behaviors we've tried in vain to explain by appealing to it can be understood more simply with experimentally established principles. In fact, I'd urge you to undertake an exercise. It's a little late in the day since you've heard most of the talks. See if you can avoid using the terms mind, mental structures, cognitive processes, or even consciousness, if you dare. If you do, you'll find the only things you are talking about are the observed events that science deals with, namely behavior and the physical events that cause it. Such an exercise will force you to be much more conservative and parsimonious in your thinking, and will lead to a more effective scientific analysis of the problems at hand. Because consciousness is not a thing, we need to understand what we mean when we use the word. In other words, we need to analyze the function of the term. Once we do that, we'll be able to show what behaviors are involved so that we can study their evolutionary and learning histories as well as their neural correlates. The result will demystify consciousness, always a risky venture and a threat to those who like their mysteries intact. To begin, let's ask what consciousness is. In my question, the word consciousness is in quotation marks, which means I'm asking what we mean when we use the word, or more precisely and scientifically, what variables cause us to utter the word. By doing so, we can avoid the reification error because consciousness is, after all, only a word. In answering the question, Julian Jaynes, in his unusual and controversial book, The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind, began by asking what consciousness is not. His answer, consciousness is not involved in much of what we call perception. It's not involved in performing many skills, for example, playing the piano or playing basketball, and in fact can interfere with their execution. It's not necessary when speaking, writing, listening, and reading, or for much of what we call thinking and learning. Jaynes concludes that consciousness has no location except an imaginary one. For example, if you say that I'm conscious of the microphone, you don't mean that I adjust it or talk into it. That would be perception. Or that I'm conscious of playing the guitar just because I can play fluently, a skill. Or that a child learning to read is conscious, reading and learning. When you drove to the conference today on the freeways and couldn't remember one thing that happened along the way, then for our purposes, you weren't conscious of the drive, even though you perceived many things, executed numerous complex skills, and also read signs. Now, unless you were abducted by aliens at the beginning of your trip and plopped back down in your car just as you arrived, which is an experience I believe Michael can relate to, then what we want to know is this. If you weren't conscious of the drive, the other drivers, etc., then what exactly were you doing? Well, I'll tell you. You were talking and maybe imagining to yourself about something other than the stimuli related to driving the car. If you were a presenter, perhaps you were rehearsing your talk. This is what Jaynes, and I think most of us, mean by being conscious, or the conscious inner life. I've already stated that we won't find the snark we call consciousness in the recesses of a non-existent mind or in the neural architecture of the brain. We must therefore operationalize the term so we can generate an accurate description of the behaviors involved. Rather than speculating endlessly about vague, unobserved mental constructs, a behavioral approach looks not only to the behaviors and current environmental events that cause us to say that someone is conscious, but more importantly, to the individual's learning history that establishes those relationships in the first place. It turns out that the answers are elegant and demonstrate how, as Chalmers puts it, an understanding of consciousness fits easily into the natural order. To know how we most often use the term consciousness, that is, its function, we need to ask three relatively simple questions. First, what is someone doing, what exactly is someone doing or saying when she is described as being conscious? Second, what are the circumstances that precipitate those behaviors? And perhaps most important, what are the past or present consequences for the behaviors that occur under those circumstances? In other words, how do we learn the particular behaviors that we describe as consciousness? This is the most important question because the answer will provide an ultimate explanation of how and why we become conscious, and it will supply neuroscientists with the roadmap they need to carry out their search for the neural correlates. As I've already intimated, the answer to the first question, what exactly is someone doing or saying when she is described as being conscious, is that she's talking or signing or writing about both her external and internal environments and her own public and private behavior. Daniel Dennett recently came around more fully to this position when he wrote that acquiring a human language, an oral or sign language, is a necessary precondition for consciousness. To paraphrase Descartes, I talk to myself, therefore I know I exist. And Helen Keller knew the importance of learning to describe oneself when she wrote that, before my teacher came to me, I did not know that I am. I lived in a world that was no world. I cannot hope to describe adequately that unconscious yet conscious time of nothingness. Since I had no power of thought, I did not compare one mental state with another. She seems to have understood implicitly what behavioral psychologist B.F. Skinner said, that being conscious is reacting to one's own behavior verbally, and thus, ironically, is a social product taught to us by others. The problem becomes even thornier when our self-talk recedes to the covert or private level, creating much of the so-called conscious inner life that intrigues many. With this operational definition of consciousness, I'd like to turn to a more detailed answer to the second and third questions. What are the circumstances that provoke our self-talk, and how do we become conscious? Let me begin with an example of how a child learns to become conscious of her environment, followed by examples of how she learns to become conscious of her public behavior and her private events, that is, the stimuli and behavior within her own skin. Becoming self-aware begins simply enough with being taught how to label objects. Language-learning children are taught to label everything through a process called discrimination learning. The parent points to a dog and asks, "What's that?" Before the child knows the answer, the parent models it by saying, "Doggy," or "That's a doggy. Can you say doggy?" If the child imitates, she can say, "Doggy." Of course, she doesn't yet know it's a dog. She's simply imitating. But after several trials, especially interspersed with trials regarding other objects such as books, cups, balls, the child can quickly say doggy when the parent points to the dog and poses the question. Later, simply the sight of the dog is sufficient to get the child to say doggy. In teaching this, the attentive parent reinforces the child's correct response by repeating, "Yes, that's a doggy." This is how the child comes to know her environment in the sense that she can talk about it. Progressing from simple names to saying more about things increases the child's consciousness of her environment. For example, being able to say only doggy in the presence of a dog reflects little consciousness compared with being able to say, "It's a small brown dachshund with a long tail and a loud bark that always runs around." But single labels are acquired first, and contrary to claims by some that parents don't teach their children language, I'll let you guess who the some are, there is considerable scientific evidence that this linguistic competence is indeed learned from parents and others in the verbal community. We can very successfully teach our children to describe and hence be conscious of their external environment because we can check their answers for accuracy. If we ask what color a red object is and the child says blue, we can see that it's wrong and correct the answer. Thus, the reliability of teaching awareness of the external environment is exceptionally high. Parents then begin asking their children other questions, such as, "What are you doing?" In the beginning, before the child knows the answer, the parent must provide it, just as the parent did when teaching about the environment. And because the parent can see what the child is doing, the answer is always correct. So when a child is banging a cup on the table and the parent asks, "What are you doing? Are you banging the cup?" and the child imitatively answers, "Banging cup," the parent reinforces the response by saying, "Right, you're banging the cup, and please stop." Of course, once this response is learned, the next time the parent asks the child, "What are you doing?" the child will likely say, well, either nothing or banging the cup. Whether or not the child is banging the cup, this is a principle of stimulus generalization, and it's found in all instances of learning, but particularly conspicuous when language learning. Clearly, we would not yet say the child is conscious that she's banging the cup, but she's on her way. After considerable experience with the parents discriminating different actions by the child and teaching the child how to describe them, we can now say that the child has at least the beginnings of self-awareness in the sense that she can describe what she's doing. The more words she can use to describe her actions, the greater we say her self-awareness is. When we say that someone is totally unaware of her actions, what we usually mean is that she cannot describe, either to herself or others, what she does. Sometimes we go to therapy so that therapists can help us become conscious of our own actions. A therapist does this like the parent of a language learning child, by observing our behavior and teaching us to make the same observations and then how to talk more accurately about them. Once we can do that and say the same things to ourselves, we are said to have increased our awareness or to have become more self-conscious of our actions. So far, so good. We're still in the observable world where we can operate objectively. But then, to paraphrase a favorite novel of mine by Joseph Heller, something happens. Parents don't stop with teaching children to describe their publicly observable behavior. They try to teach their children to describe their private world. They use the same methods, but without the same level of success. Consider how a parent might teach a child to say, "My tummy hurts." The pain in the stomach is a stimulus generated by illness or injury. But unlike the child banging the cup, the parent doesn't have access to the child's pain. So how does the parent teach the child to say it hurts? The parent must rely on other sources of information. There are at least two ways that others can teach someone to label or describe a private stimulus. First, the verbal community can look for some public event that reliably accompanies the private one. In the case of a stomach ache, there isn't much to go on, save maybe for a distended stomach or vomiting. In the case of learning to say that a cut or a bruise hurts, the site of the cut or the bruise is the publicly accompanying event. A second way others can teach us about our own private events is to look for additional or corresponding responses. In the case of a stomach ache, the child may hold her stomach or rub it or vomit. But based upon these corresponding responses generated by the same painful stimuli, the parent teaches the child to report that "my tummy hurts." The same process occurs when we're taught to describe our overt and covert behavior and private stimuli with such expressions as "I'm depressed," "I'm scared," "I'm anxious," or "I'm sad." Even then, others need more information to teach the correct description. For example, simply observing someone crying gives us little to go on to accurately teach him to describe how he's feeling. Is he sad, hurt, or extremely happy? In such cases, we need to observe the precipitating environmental conditions or context. Nevertheless, all we can rely on to teach self-awareness is observable behavior, publicly accompanying events, corresponding responses, and the stimulating environment. There is no direct access to someone else's private world. It's no wonder, then, that when asked how we feel, we often don't know or can't put it into words. In addition to learning to respond verbally to private stimuli, something else happens which complicates the problem in manifold ways. Our overt public descriptions, verbal descriptions, recede to the covert or private level that only we can observe. How does this happen? As parents can attest, once language learning children learn a lot of names, they go around labeling everything out loud. "Look, Daddy, car, doggy, man, ball." Convinced that we've done our job of teaching the correct names of things, we urge our children to say it to yourself quietly, reinforcing quieter and quieter talking, or ignoring or mildly discouraging louder outbursts. The result isn't magic, but as far as many are concerned, it may as well be. What happens is that the child's verbal behavior continues, but at a level unobserved by others. The child still says car, doggy, man, ball, but to herself. Call it thinking or cognitive if you want, but except for its observability, the behavior is the same. And neurological evidence shows the same areas of the brain are active while speaking out loud as when speaking to oneself. Covert self-talk, or thinking, if you will, involves the same behaviors and brain areas as when the behaviors are public, thus preserving the continuity of behavior and obviating the need to invent what I call cognitive ghosts. Although I briefly commented on the brain earlier, I'd like to revisit the topic in light of the preceding analysis. If by consciousness we mean talking, either overtly or covertly, about the environment, our own overt and covert behavior, and the stimuli that cause it, then we already know a lot about the brain's role in accomplishing it. As psychologists Neil Carlson and William Buskus note, the physiological basis of consciousness is the activity of language area mechanisms in the brain. Although the actual verbal descriptions are learned according to fairly well understood principles, the learning changes the brain, which then mediates between the stimulating environment and the verbal behavior of the conscious person. Evidence of consciousness as a verbal description of the environment in general and of our own behavior in particular comes from numerous examples of brain damage and from the so-called split brain studies. One example mentioned earlier is anterograde amnesia. Patients with this disorder, which usually involves damage to the hippocampus, can learn new behaviors but cannot talk about what they've learned. They can also remember, that is, talk about things they learned before the brain damage. In the parlance of memory researchers, we can say that the damage has disrupted their explicit remembering, or verbal descriptions, while leaving their implicit remembering, or nonverbal skills, intact. Following from the present thesis, people with anterograde amnesia are thus conscious only of what they knew before the brain damage, and of course, of ongoing events in their lives. In another disorder resulting from brain damage called visual agnosia, individuals cannot recognize objects by sight. By recognize, we mean the patients cannot say the name of the object when seeing it. In a more specific form called prosopagnosia, or face blindness, a person cannot recognize certain faces by sight. Again, by recognize, we mean the patient cannot say the person's name when seeing her face. In other words, the patient is not conscious of who the person is. Interestingly, the patient can say the person's name when hearing her voice and is thus conscious of the person. Because patients with visual agnosia are not blind, have no difficulty navigating visually through their environment, and can actually mime the behaviors related to objects shown to them, we can describe their disorder as a disconnection between perception and awareness. The final example represents one of the more interesting phenomena related to consciousness, the split brain studies. As many of you know, in some severe cases of epilepsy, the corpus callosum, the wide band of axons that join the two hemispheres of the brain, is severed to prevent the seizure from spreading to the opposite hemisphere. Although the surgery successfully controls the spread of seizures, researchers discovered a fascinating phenomenon. For example, if a spoon is briefly presented to the left visual field of split brain patients, they cannot say what they'd seen, but they can pick out the spoon when asked to feel an assortment of objects with their right hand. But if the spoon is briefly presented to the patient's right visual field, the patient can say spoon. Thus, the patients are conscious of the spoon only when there are neural connections between the visual system and the primary language areas of the brain, thus enabling them to call it a spoon. If by consciousness we mean a person can talk about her external and internal environments and overt and covert behavior, then neuroscientists already have a good understanding of its neural correlates because they know much about the cortical and subcortical regions of the brain that combine to produce language. Thus, we don't need to debate ad infinitum what consciousness is or where it's located, or try, like phrenologists, to look for the seat of consciousness in the brain. You can tell this is my last topic. It's at the end of the slide. So what is this so-called conscious inner life that we find so mysterious and elusive? Behavioral psychologists believe that the only things inside us are anatomical and physiological structures, including sensory receptors for pain, temperature, pressure, and proprioception. The primary difference between these interoceptive receptors and the exteroceptive ones in the eyes, ears, and on the surface of the skin is their location. Thus, if we can discover the role of public stimuli on behavior, then because private stimuli differ only in their location, not in their type, we can parsimoniously assume they have the same functions. If we learn, for example, to describe painful stimulation on the surface of the skin, then we can learn to describe painful stimulation inside the body. This is indeed an inner life, but not the one that so mystifies and intrigues many. In addition, as I've already stated, any behavior may recede to a covert or private level. For example, the pianist may covertly practice finger placements, the golfer covert golf swings or hand placements on the club, and of course, the fluent ASL user covert signing. Behavior, as caused proximately by the firing of neurons in the motor cortex, exists on a continuum of intensity. If I start screaming, I can gradually reduce the intensity of my vocal output to normal talking and then whispering until I'm the only one who can hear me. I'm behaving privately, covertly, but behaving nonetheless. However, the behavior is not taking place in my mind or in my consciousness because there are no such places. Just as evolutionary biologists assume a continuity of species, behavioral psychologists assume a continuity of behavior and the physical events that cause it. The good news is that such an assumption is parsimonious and can suggest an elegant solution to the problem of the nature and origin of consciousness. The bad news is that many people won't find the analysis as sexy and mysterious as speculating about consciousness, neurons, or qualia. One reason is simply because they're not familiar with the science behind behavioral theory. It's a complicated, sophisticated, and still growing experimental science. Those of you who believe behaviorism is dead, it is not dead. It is small, but it is not dead. It's very active. And hopefully I'm at least one individual representative of that. A more important reason that people won't find the analysis very, very sexy is because we've all been reared in a culture where ordinary common sense terms have been used to describe and explain human behavior for millennia. We simply cannot imagine that we don't have minds or free will, or that our inner life isn't anything more than private stimuli and learned or unlearned covert behavior. My account of conscious experience may or may not be correct, but it's parsimonious because it appeals to observed relationships and experimentally established principles. We skeptics find it all too easy to find fault with obvious pseudosciences, but when it comes to our own messy, unscientific thinking, we are a lot less critical. It will take much longer to realize that consciousness may be nothing more than a learned repertoire of verbal behavior than it did to realize that the Earth is not flat, that it's not the center of the universe, and that life on Earth wasn't designed by a creator. Thank you very much for your attention.
Good job.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to have a lively Q&A, I can see. Oh, yeah. In this rat lab that I worked in, while they're fiddling around with this, we had all our rats numbered, but we named them just for fun, after the Dodgers in the 70s. And one of the rats, these are all white rats, they're pretty tame, they're very nice, except one, Davy Lopes, who was the shortstop for the Dodgers, was a really nasty, nasty rat. And you had to put on this big, thick leather glove to get him out of there and put him in the Skinner box and all this stuff. And we used to do this fun thing where we'd take a pencil with an eraser on the end and stick it in the cage of Davy Lopes, and he would pull it out, and the thing would be shredded. And then we'd say, but of course, if you put your hand in there, your finger, he would never bite it. Of course, no one ever took us up on this until I tried it to a guest who came to the lab, and I did the, with Davy Lopes, and he shredded it. And I said, and the amazing thing is he would never do this to your own finger, to which she put her finger in there, and bam. Anyway, this was the last time I did it. I don't know if this is a Skinnerian thing or what. So we are to our last speaker. Thank you for your patience. We have been a real ultra marathon here, that's for sure. I saved Ursula for last because she looks at strict, hard, detailed science as well as the big picture. So Ursula earned her PhD at Harvard University, where she then taught for several years before she moved to the University of Washington University in St. Louis, where she's a professor of biology. She's written 3 editions of the widely adapted textbook Genetics and has served in numerous capacities in international biomedical arenas. That's the hard science stuff that she does. She's also on the Council of the Institute for Religion in the Age of Science, and she's written a really important book. I think one of the most important you can read in terms of how can you be a spiritual person if you're an atheist, a skeptic, a humanist, you don't believe in God or whatever. Where does your spirituality come from? The sacred depths of nature is the answer to that question, or at least one really good answer to that question. She's also on the editorial board of Zygon, which is sort of the premier journal of religion and science. And you can catch her on PBS and NPR and various television shows where she's become, because of her book, it was a bestseller, she's become kind of the premier talking head, as it were, of that whole subject. That is spirituality from a scientific point of view. Please help me welcome Ursula. Good enough.
Hi, well, can you hear me? Is this good? It's hard to be the mop-up person, but what I'm going to do is a big overview kind of thing and try as I go along, even though I prepared this talk before I came here, it turns out that a lot of the things that I want to say are things that other people have covered, and so perhaps this will, get this so I can, all right. Perhaps this will sort of serve to let you sit back and kind of think of the whole thing. This title is the title that I used at the Esalen talks, and Michael said he wanted me to do the same thing here. The trouble was that he said he wanted me to do the exact same thing. Then I had an hour, and now I have half an hour. But I've cut, and I think I'm going to be able to make it fine, or at least I was able to in my bedroom at home. Okay, so a lot of what I'm going to talk about represents a lot of conversation and interaction over the years with Terry Deacon, and he is very important in my thinking and all of this. And he gave us this very wonderful quote in his book, The Symbolic Species, biologically, we are just another ape. Mentally, we are a whole new phylum of organism. And here is our family tree with our other apes. I'm first going to talk about the concept emergence, and emergence is used in all sorts of hand-wavy kind of ways. I'm going to try to give it a little bit of meat, and then talk about the emergence of awareness, brains, and symbolic minds. And then at the end, a little bit on morality, because that was also in my title. So first, emergent properties or processes. So emergence relates to what happens when atoms, ultimately, interact. And when they do, their relationship to one another can generate something else or something more from nothing but. That's kind of the T-shirt slogan for an emergent property. And we find them all over the non-living world. So here's water and a water spider on it. And this surface tension is, for example, an emergent property. So this is nothing but water molecules if we reduce, and of course we can reduce the water molecules to their quarks if we want to, but it's also something that when water molecules get together in liquid form, they create this surface tension, this something more. It emerges. And similarly, again with a snowflake, it's nothing but water molecules, but in this case, the initial and boundary conditions of how the water molecules interact with each other as they move through different temperatures and humidities generates different patterns of crystal growth, and so we get this emergent property of the snowflake's patterns. Now, a snowflake itself is just a evanescent phenomenon. Snowflakes don't have kids and that kind of thing. But it turns out that when we think about biology, what we have in biology is also emergent properties. So the difference is, though, that in this case, they're encoded and remembered. And we call these emergent properties traits. In biology, not only are these traits remembered, but because they're remembered, the very fact that they're remembered means that they can evolve. So they're encoded in genes and their regulatory elements. And as we know, information degrades, and particularly DNA molecules can mutate, so we get these variant traits, and then organisms that traits that are better adapted to their circumstances are more likely to transmit these instructions to their offspring, and all I've just said is Darwinian natural selection, but putting it in the context of traits. And here's a very important thing that isn't often brought up, particularly in a lot of the gene-centered ways of thinking about evolution, which is that natural selection doesn't see genes at all. It doesn't have any idea what genes or proteins are in there, important as they are for getting the result. Natural selection sees these traits and is completely blind to how they're generated. So emergent properties, then, this whole idea of having them is really important for everything having to do with the evolution of life. Once you get an emergent property, a trait of some sort, that's encoded and expressed in an organism, then as these diverge, you can sometimes get new traits sort of coming out from existing ones. So you can say that traits beget traits, or emergent properties beget emergent properties. And we could illustrate this in a number of ways, but one, we could look at the evolution of awareness, which begins to take us into what we're thinking about here. So if we look at awareness, we can say an awareness is just an organism's ability to detect some sort of a sign out in the environment, a molecule, another organism, all sorts of levels, and respond to it in some sort of an appropriate fashion. So cells are aware of their environment, and the nothing but in this case is the receptors and the signaling molecules that are in the cell that allow this awareness to occur. And then we have cellular awareness is the nothing but in neural awareness, which are nerves, but they have these additional interesting properties of being able to move over long distances. But in the end, they're just working like cells with neurotransmitters and receptors. Once neurons came into evolutionary being, we quickly probably have brains, the idea of places where neurons just talk to each other as opposed to running the organism. And then in our own lineage, we come to brain-based awareness, giving rise to these language-based symbolic minds, and then finally self-awareness. So I'll be talking about these in a minute. But first, let's think about brain development a little bit, because that hasn't really been covered here. And there's an important difference between our kinds of brains and the brain, for example, of something like a worm. And that is that a worm's brain is really determined. You can go in any worm, it always has 302 neurons, they're always at the same place, you can always figure out what you're doing, and the worm has, therefore, by definition, totally stereotypic kinds of behavior. If you go to a mammal, by contrast, it's a completely different game in terms of making a mammalian brain. There are billions of neurons in every one of these brains, and the embryonic neurons grow out into the cranium with very minimal instructions. They know that they're supposed to go and where they're supposed to do, but a lot of what happens has to do with the other neurons they encounter, what kinds of growth factors they secrete, and so on. And it's a very emergent process, if I may, and rather than anything that's fixed. And because of this, mammalian brains are wonderfully evolvable. That is, because they're emergent, because what happens first influences what happens next and what happens next, you get a situation where small heritable changes, just differences in the numbers of neurons that are growing out or where they happen to go, something can be encoded such that you get a very different result as an outcome, as opposed to something like a worm brain where you have to sort of change it one neuron at a time. So a nice example of the evolvability of the mammalian brain is this blind mole rat. So here's a typical rodent with neurons going into the brain from the eye and the ear and touch, and going to these regions of the cortex that are involved in these. The blind mole rat is blind, and blind because it lives underground, and so any mutations that influence its ability to make an eye are not selected against, because there's nothing to see down there anyway. And so, as with other animals who live in the dark, there's a reduction in the eye and in the input to the brain. But what happens is that these other neurons come in here and take over this visual cortex and turn it into auditory and tactile. That is, the cortex isn't there to be visual. It is influenced by the input that comes into it. And this is then a way that we can get an entirely different kind of brain, because there's nothing very determined about the whole process. Another way that we can think of as the mammalian brain being evolvable is just this whole size business that was been mentioned earlier. You can, just by having a few extra divisions, get a whole new part of brains that are now cells that are kind of looking around and can have new opportunities. And this is, for example, the human brain and the intuited embryonic stem cell production in the embryonic brain. And here's the part as to which percent is based on body size. And what we see is that there's a whole lot of our brain, as we know, that is much larger than expected on the basis of the body size. And this generates the possibility of new synaptic opportunities. So with that much background, we can now look at very speculative, I might say, but I hope interesting to you, ideas about what might have happened during hominid evolution to get us the kinds of brains and minds that we have. Most people in evolutionary biology, and that's what I do for a living, is think about common ancestors. And when we see modern organisms that we're comparing, if we see lots of traits that they have in common, we assume that the common ancestor also had those traits. Whereas if we see something that's different in the two modern organisms, we figure that those differences arose since they last had their common ancestor. And if we make a list of mental traits that we share with chimpanzees and bonobos, the list is long. And it's a lot longer than this, but there's intelligence, the social lifestyle, dependence on nurture for mental development in the kids, the same spectrum of temperaments, and learning by imitation and by experience. So there's lots of ways that we're not different from them at all. The most distinctive human trait, and the one I'll focus on, and one that Hank also lifted up for us, is that we have these ability to transmit cultural understandings via symbolic language. So that's what I want to focus on my remarks on, is what do we mean by that? Okay, so symbolic language, lots of animals communicate, of course, but symbolic language is something else. It involves having these abstractions that we call words, and we have these indices in our brains that these words somehow access, and then we can just manipulate these words syntactically using the rules that languages follow, and we get these emergent concepts that have a life of their own. They can go into imaginative states and planning ahead and all the other things. And we can reconceptualize old ideas to get new ideas. So language really is a new kid on the block. There's nothing like it in the animal world. And importantly, also, what we do with this language is not only to learn by imitation, which other animals can do, but there's a very distinct thing that humans do, which is to teach, to explain, to point, to indicate what's going on, as opposed to learning just by watching others. And this is also language-based. And as Hank pointed out, it turns out that most of this new stuff that we're so proud of that came through in our hominid evolution, in the enlargement of our brain size, is involved with generating language. We don't know how it works yet. It's going to be a fascinating problem, equally interesting as figuring out what consciousness is. And indeed, what I'll try to at least suggest is that, and Hank has also made this point also, that maybe the two projects aren't that far apart from each other. So if we assume then that this enlargement of the human brain and this rewiring perhaps of the human brain had to do with a reconfiguration for language skills, what kinds of ways could we even think about how that might have occurred? What kind of scenarios? And I'm going to present you with two and just see what you think. So the first scenario is called cultural masking. And the basic idea of masking is explained in the next two slides. A species that's hardwired to do something in its lifestyle. We know that that's true for all behaviors. But if the function becomes available to the species from the outside, then we're sort of in the same situation as we are with the blind mole rat. That is, if a mutation occurs in that original function such that it no longer occurs, it doesn't matter because the function is already supplied from the outside. And so the organism doesn't need this to be genetically hardwired anymore. Natural selection, therefore, doesn't act on these mutations, and so they tend to degrade. And there are a number of examples of this, but my favorite is the one of vitamin C. So most organisms make ascorbic acid, which is vitamin C, and it's essential for their survival. But the idea is that apes, when they started eating fruit, fruit has a lot of vitamin C in it. And as a result, mutations in enzymes involved in synthesizing vitamin C were not selected against because you're already getting plenty of ascorbic acid from the fruit. So as a result, humans and chimps, there's actually a pseudogene in our genome that used to be the enzyme in the last step in making vitamin C. It's now degraded, and we are now addicted to vitamin C from the outside. So this same idea could be applied then to humans in terms of culture. That culture, once we started having culture and getting our information from culture during hominid evolution, that this masked the need for redundant heritable mental pathways, and that these degraded, and that this is why I talked about this whole idea of the evolvable mammalian brain. If you have pathways that are degrading, this frees up brain space, and I use the word in huge quotes, to reconfigure the kinds of minds that we have that are dependent on, that can do this symbolic language, and hence acquire the cultural information that means that the instinctive part isn't necessary anymore. And the key thing here then is if anything like this is going on, and it's certainly the case in any case, is that hominids are dependent on culture for survival. We're addicted to it for these understandings and for the language that we learn from it. Many have suggested why it is that we need language. There's a whole thing about, man the tool maker and how you have to have language to make tools, which I could never figure out. There's sexual selection scenarios. But the one I'm going to try to offer is my second scenario, which is the whole idea of niche construction. So the niche construction idea is best seen by thinking about the beaver. So beavers are rodents that do this extraordinary thing of chopping down trees and building dams. And if you look at a beaver, everything about beaverness has to do with this activity. They have these tails, they can swim, whereas most mice can just do this. They got these big teeth. Everything is about making these ponds, and they live in these ponds and are then protected from predators as a result. So the beaver then constructs dams and then is selected for its capacity to construct and thrive in these dam-created aquatic niches. They're artificial. Beaver has to make these things, him or herself. And humans, I think we might say, construct cultures. Well, we not might say, we do construct cultures. And we're selected for our capacity to construct and thrive in these culture-created mental niches. So what we get then, this is the important point, is a three-way coevolution. So two-way coevolutions you see all the time. This changes and therefore that changes and it goes like this. But here we have a much more interesting possibility, which is that there are three parameters that are co-evolving, which means that if two change, the third one, it gets much more complicated. And the coevolution goes as follows, that human culture is encoded in and acquired by symbolic languages. Symbolic languages have been selected for their ability to be learnable by children's brains, and children's brains have been selected for their ability to acquire languages. And so the ability to have these language-encoded cultural understandings is all co-evolving with the emergence of these symbolic minds. And since these ideas have come to me, mostly through Terry, it's really quite dramatically changed my way that I think about humans. So now we come to what you guys have been calling consciousness. So consciousness, from my perspective, just to put one more chip into the ring, I think that, my cat is conscious. I mean, she takes in what happens and she makes decisions and stuff like that. And I think, for me, it's more helpful to think about consciousness as a brain-based phenomenon, and to think of what we do is this other thing that my favorite word for it is actually the narrative self. And there are quotes like this from Jerry Fodor, just another one of how impossible it is to think that anything, that material could be conscious. But I think that it's also important to say that that is a problem, but that a lot of the articulations that we've heard today are more to do with this awareness of self, this self-awareness that we do. And I agree with Hank and, in particular, that a lot of that has to do with language-competent minds, that we really are telling ourselves stories and talking to ourselves, and that it's something clearly that's popping through, but it's popping through, I think, the thing that we really need to understand, or at least the research project that I think is best for understanding consciousness, is to understand more about language and how it works. So finally, just a little squib on moral understandings, and a lot of this has been said already this afternoon, and particularly with a lot of wonderful and exciting new stuff on brain-based aspects of this. But in the same kind of thinking, here's how I come out on this. So first of all, the idea that moral understandings come from the beyond is not going to fly here. The idea that it has to do with just human reason, reasoning is part of it, but I think that there's a much more interesting idea that comes through as we think about the evolution of the human, and that is that it's in our primate nature to be moral. It's natural to be moral. So let me develop that argument, and then we can close. So we are social organisms, and that is a very important piece of understanding who we are. All organisms are self-interested. I mean, by definition, that's a definition of an organism. An organism that isn't self-interested enough to get food and protect itself stuff, doesn't make it. So self-interest goes with the territory. Social lineages, at the least, engage in overlaps of self-interest. That's basically a definition, a minimalist definition of a social lineage. And so there are dolphins and wolves and everything, and they all have different ways that they cooperate to do this. In primate lineages, we see lots of examples of kin altruism. We see strategic reciprocity, I'll scratch your back, you scratch mine, and a whole hierarchical system of who's alpha and so on. And all of this is very well understood and stabilizes the group. I would say that we have all of that ourselves in our economic and political systems. But in addition, in non-human primates, we also encounter what we could call moral sentiments, and several others have talked about this already. But let's just sort of, can you see this, or the lights? It's okay? Okay, well, so this is a troupe of bonobos, and illustrates sort of the first kinds of things. What goes on here in terms of these social interactions is a lot of hierarchical considerations, some strategic reciprocity of who gets food and so on. So this is basically their political economic system showing up here. But when we talk about morality, we're usually not talking about political and economic systems, we're talking about other stuff. And we don't have to look very hard to find the other stuff in these animals. And Frans de Waal and others have spent a lot of time reminding us of this. They have very wonderful interactions with their children. And indeed, they play with their kids. This whole play thing is really troop-wide, and so you play with everybody's babies throughout the time that you can. They are very affectionate with each other, not only as children, but also as adults. This whole grooming ritual that they do, they have friendships. Their friendships are very important and long-lasting, and animals that don't have friends are miserable. And there are lots of examples of things like this. This chimp has been injured, and this other one is looking. And again, because of our intuition, I think we can look at these faces and look at these behaviors and sense I don't think it's just sort of reading in and, oh, isn't it cute how this ape is like a human. The people who have been out in the field living with these animals say that emotionally they're very much like we are. So the proposal about our morality sort of goes as follows, that language generates the capacity in general, but in morality in particular here, to experience and transfigure our pro-social primate minds. So the idea is that as we evolved along our own lineage over the last 5 million years, our ape and moral sentiments were not left in the evolutionary dustbin. But it's not like we experience them the way apes experience them either. We experience them the way human minds experience things, which is this symbolically. So if we make our last list here, we can make a list, and this one sort of makes sense to a lot of people, that sex, which is of course all the way through the animals, all through the eukaryotes, there's an emergent way, a symbolic way of thinking about it that has to do with sexuality. That nurture, the nurture that we see with these animals with their kids, transports into care, empathy into compassion, reciprocity into fair-mindedness, our concepts of justice, and perhaps more controversial, but I believe that this whole notion of hierarchy and seeing things that are larger and smaller than yourself has a lot to do with what is a very important emotion from my perspective, and that's our capacity for reverence. And then just simple knowledge, when infused with all of our other understandings, generates our capacity for mindfulness. So that's all very well, but there's this whole thing about moral motivation. What motivates you to be moral? Why would you do it? And there are cultural influences, of course, of reward and punishment, some of which have been talked about here. There's a rush of oxytocin, perhaps. But I would say that the rushes of oxytocin and lots of other complicated things that are going on with us neurophysiologically need to be coupled somehow with a very interesting to me human capacity that actually David Hume talked about a lot in his philosophical writings, that we experience moral beauty. And it's very interesting when we talk about, like the firefighters at 9/11 or something like that. There's this, you put your hand over your heart. Everybody does it. I saw the people in India doing that and talking about these things. And I think what moral beauty is and why we are so responsive to it is something that should be talked about a lot more. Lastly, of course, the thing that gets in the way of these moral sentiments and seeking moral beauty the most is, of course, what we can call toxic self-interest, as opposed to just self-maintaining self-interest that goes with all social organisms. And it's my proposition, the last one I'll make, one more, that this toxic self-interest is particularly exacerbated by stress. So bonobos, for example, the males are never observed to fight in the jungle, but they actually can damage each other very severely when they're put into zoos. And it can also be manipulated by culture, so that this inherent idea of doing self-preservation can be manipulated into fearfulness, and resource acquisition, again a normal function, can be manipulated as to a need for more or greed. And I see fear and greed as being huge problems in our time. Often when I talk about this, people come up and say, well, what about xenophobia? And what about the fact that, all animals, all primates just sort of trash their environment, don't think about anything? And I think that we could say that xenophobia and ecological indifference, we can call it, were once adaptive. It doesn't matter in the jungle whether you trash what you're eating, because there's more stuff right in the next region. And xenophobia, if you're a social group, particularly under stress and other troops are trying to get into your face, is probably an adaptive thing. And we clearly have struggles with both xenophobia and ecological indifference in our heritage. But I'd like to leave you with the idea that I think is really important for particularly an educated group like this to understand, which is that these are both errors. They were adaptive at the time, but they're erroneous. Because we now understand that, there's no such thing as other if we take all of life, that we all have a common ancestor, that we all share many of our genes, and that it's, what is other? What is xenophobia anyway? And that becomes even more apparent when we look at our lineage once again, thinking about our common ancestry with the apes, but also, of course, the obvious fact that all of us are related to humans that lived in Africa 100 or so thousand years ago. Everyone in this room has an ancestor that had black skin, and it's just, xenophobia is just bullshit. And finally, of course, ecological indifference makes a whole lot of sense when your entire turf is the next trees in the jungle. But we now understand that this is where we really live. It's very balanced. It's very important for us to pay complete attention to keeping it as beautiful as it is. Thank you.
Excellent, Ursula. Thank you. So nice. Let's have our speakers come on up here, and let's get your questions ready. We're going to go straight to that and then have dinner.
Do we need any more questions, dude?
Oh, well, we got lots of questions. Actually, we got plenty of questions. Well, we're going to eat. Well, we're just going to do questions, then we're going to eat.
There's a question here which sort of links a couple of things together, that any test of the brain done when instructed to be conscious, and there's a whole area of research at the moment being done called affective neuroscience. One of the people who does this is a chap called Richard Davidson at the University of Wisconsin, and he's been working with a lot of the monks that the Dalai Lama associates with, and there's been a lot of experimentation done in various meditative states to see exactly what's going on. And it seems to me that there's an interesting correlation here between some of the stuff that Sue was saying earlier, in that we're beginning to find out more of a connection between what you'd have to call Eastern and Western ways of investigation. I suspect that the fact that the Dalai Lama is going to be a speaker at the Society for Neuroscience conference this November is not incidental. And I think, as my wife says, that if the Buddha were alive today, he'd probably be a neuroscientist. So let's move on and see if, let's take this, a really ultimate question here. Can physical determinism and can physical determinism and free will coexist? To what degree was the flipping of my hand that Susan had us doing started by the Big Bang?
No and completely.
Your questions.
No and completely.
Sorry?
No and completely.
No and completely. Okay. Any of the other panelists want to talk about that one?
Oh, that'll do.
Okay, well,
Sorry, no.
that's a tough audience that dispatched that one very quickly. Let me put a couple together here. Can you explain the advent of consciousness in terms of natural selection and evolutionary survival advantages? Dr. Sanowski, what implications does your research on neural economics have for the issue of free will versus determinism again? Or what if I threw out a statement like, consciousness is the state that we enter in response to salient information. When we're talking about driving a car and we're not spending any time attending to what is going on, we get from point A to point B. We have no idea how we did it because it's just information that we've used before, very simple. It's not salient anymore. Of course, it becomes salient if somebody runs in front of your car. Then suddenly the journey becomes a memorable one.
So this is a question about attention. One of the things that psychologists have really studied very carefully is the ability to which you can filter out irrelevant information from the environment and focus on and respond to a specific piece of information that may be very relevant. It doesn't necessarily have to be the most salient. It doesn't have to be the one that's the brightest. It could be something fairly subtle. For example, a red light. And you're in this beautiful paradise and the red light comes on. Well, depending on the context, you might want to stop your car, or on the other hand, if you're in a movie theater and the red light comes on, you might want to worry about fire. So how you respond to a subtle piece of information really, you have to include how you interpret that piece of information. Now, going to the earlier part of that question having to do with determinism, the more we learn by recording from large populations of neurons in the brain is that there's a probabilistic element. If you repeat the same stimulus twice, you never get the same response twice. And that's because there's internal state variables. And as I said, how you interpret a piece of information may depend on your expectations and what it is you're looking for when that sensory stimulus occurs. So I think that there's plenty of room for variability, both from the perspective of fluctuations within the physical content of the brain, but also how it is that the probabilities, for example, are changing over time. How you interpret a stimulus will depend on how hungry you are, for example. You know, how I look at a piece of food, an apple, might look very different in my brain when I'm hungry compared to if I'm not. And so I think that there's a lot of probabilistic computing going on there, and most of it's not, unfortunately, available to introspection. We just don't know how we come up with these decisions.
Do anybody want to try and add to that? Do you see any functional, adaptive reason for having something that we call consciousness?
I'd like to say something about that.
I bet you would.
Sounds ominous. It's a very natural idea to think that since we are conscious, it must have evolved, and if it evolved, it must have a function. But that's not necessarily so. And you can get in big muddles thinking about that. For example, if you are an identity theorist or even a functionalist, you're going to say consciousness itself didn't evolve. What evolved was all the capacities that's led us to be this kind of creature. So all, perception, learning, memory, all of these things evolved for reasons. But consciousness, if you're an identity theorist, just is those things. Or if you're a functionalist, it necessarily comes about with those things. Many people working on consciousness would say that. But a whole lot of other people would say, oh, it must have a function of its own. And they start looking for that function. And then you get into a muddle. Another muddle people get into is thinking about zombies, the philosopher's zombie, the idea that there could be a creature that looks like me, behaves like me, says all the things I do, but it's all dark inside. In other words, that no consciousness, know what it's like to be. Then, if you believe in the possibility of zombies, you're going to say, well, why didn't we evolve as zombies? Why did we evolve with consciousness? Well, then you're imagining consciousness as this kind of extra something that's added on. But if a zombie is possible, that can't have any function, because if it did, you wouldn't be identical. And so these things, you just go round and round. Personally, I think it's much best to stick with the first one, either the functionalist or the identity theorist, and say somehow or another, if we evolve the way we do by natural selection for visible traits such as behaviors and perceptions and learning and so on, then what we need to understand is why a creature that evolved that way is conscious. If you're me, you'll say, well, it isn't really conscious. There's no such thing as consciousness. There's just an illusion of having a stream of consciousness. If you're some other people, you'll say, well, it naturally emerges. Those, I think, are the realm of possible answers to the question. But it's a nightmare. When I wrote the consciousness textbook, the one on evolution was just the hardest, to my surprise. I thought I understood something about evolution. Much the hardest. It gets you into big, big tangles.
There's a question for John Ullman. Do you know of evidence for or against a spatial map of emotional space in the brain? Where might one best look for such a map if it exists? The anterior cingulate cortex, amygdala, FI?
Well, there's some evidence for it. The sort of complex social emotions seem to be preferentially involved in anterior insular and frontal insular cortex, or the more they're simpler emotions like surprise or anger. You might find in cingulate. Fear, of course, has been classically associated with amygdala. So yeah, there's some evidence of a differential within these systems. Yeah.
Okay. There's a question here about lucid dreaming. Anybody want to have a crack at that? Terry, you know sleep. What on earth is going on, and how does that correlate with what we call consciousness?
Well, there's a type of dreaming called lucid dreaming, or the hypnagogic state, that occurs just as you're falling asleep. And in fact, you can enhance this. Some people can bring this about, in which you have certain conscious control, even though you are in a dreamlike state and things are happening the way that they are during REM sleep. It's a little bit like being a player and observing yourself. This is a state that probably happens on the wave between the awake state and slow wave sleep, at a time when there are very large-scale spindles occurring in the cortex that originate in the thalamus. And spindles are 10 to 14 hertz oscillations. They last for a few seconds. They're caused by low-threshold calcium bursts of spikes originating in the thalamus and then engaging cortical circuitry through feedback loops. And it's the hallmark of this transition from wakefulness to sleep. Nobody knows what spindles are for. They're a big mystery. But they continue to recur during the night, but they're especially prominent when you're falling asleep. And there may be some link between that and this lucid dreaming state, but it hasn't been investigated.
Can I add something there? It may be true that some lucid dreams occur on sleep onset REM, but the majority of lucid dreams that have been studied in the lab do not occur at sleep onset. They occur in normal REM. A lot of this work's done by Steve LaBerge in, where is he? San Francisco. And also by some other, Keith Hearn in Britain. Generally, they both agree you can find out when people are in a lucid dream by signaling with the eyes. You know that your body's paralyzed during REM sleep, except for breathing and your eyes. So you can move your eyes. And really good lucid dreamers can not only become aware, the definition of a lucid dream is you become aware during the dream that it is a dream. So it's a bit like I was talking about earlier, am I conscious now? It's, am I dreaming now? Wow, it's a dream, yay! Now, really good lucid dreamers can signal with their eyes, like 10 times back and forth to say, I'm dreaming now. You've got the electrodes on, you can say what stage of sleep. They're normally about 3/4 of the way through a REM period, late in the night, usually sort of 5 in the morning if you're having a normal sort of midnight to 8 o'clock sleep, in times of particularly high arousal during REM. My guess is that
Have you ever had a lucid dream?
Yeah, quite a lot. They're wonderful fun. I can't induce them deliberately and I can't signal from them, but yes, I enjoy them. So anyway, that'll do for... So quite a bit is now. Go to the Lucidity Institute, Steve LaBerge's work, if you want to find out more, and from there you could find out a lot more about those studies done.
There was another question on sleep, which actually I think was a misunderstanding, but let me run it to you anyway, which was that if Sarah's work showed that you can take these naps and end up with better learning and the next day and so on, is there anything in the patterns of people who have radically different sleep patterns, like the owls and the larks and so on, that correlates with that? I mean, is it just easier for people who get up bright and early in the morning to learn new stuff, or what about
unfortunately, we don't
people who
know,
stay up late at night?
We don't know. We can't ask the owls, whether they've had any good ideas when they wake up. But owls are nocturnal, so
I was using it as a...
sorry, night owls. Sorry.
Yes.
I misunderstood that.
I was actually thinking about people like you who, when I come into the lab, are still there at 3 in the morning sending out emails.
Actually, going to your point about individual variability, there's an enormous variability. There are some people who claim they don't have to sleep. If you actually track them, it turns out there are periods of inactivity when they sort of sit there and don't seem to be doing very much, but they claim they're not sleeping. And they probably don't have, they probably have very short episodes that are not as dramatic. But sleep, there's a very clear impact of sleep deprivation. Different people have different set points. Some people need more, some people need less. Some people have more REM, some less REM. And it's been very difficult to sort of correlate that with any differences in behavior, to say that people who sleep more have better ideas. But the one thing that does seem to be consistent is that people who can use their sleep by being very careful about what they read just before falling asleep. So if you, for example, are struggling with a mathematical problem and you've been sort of working on it for hours and then you go to sleep, then you're more likely, it's kind of like having gotten your brain circuits activated, but now when you go to sleep, your brain will continue to work on it for some time, and it's more likely in the morning that you'll come up with some answer to that particular question. So I know friends who actually save their problems until an hour before going to bed, and then they work on it, and they get their work done while they sleep.
And if we follow Richard McNally's evidence, it's better not to read science fiction at night as well, as you might be abducted. Ursula, let me ask you a question. You showed some slides, a PowerPoint thing and mentioned France de Waal. Mm-hmm. As you probably know, there's been some recent experiments that France has published with his postdoc there, in which they had capuchin monkeys that were trained to work for a reward, and they could also see the other monkeys that were being tested at the same time. Normally, the capuchins were being given a piece of cucumber for a reward. Occasionally, one of them would be given a grape. The ones that were getting the piece of cucumber got really irritated when they saw the ones getting the grape for the same piece of work. And they got really hissy if they saw an animal being rewarded for not even having done the work. So the suggestion there was that we have this capacity to compute fairness, should we call it, the beginnings of a moral sense, moral emotions. And there's a conflict here to some extent in that the kind of things that Terry talks about, John talks about, Paul talks about, we're talking about prediction, we're talking about reward circuitry. It sounds very mechanistic, but it's plainly at the root of these things we think of just as human values. And do you want to comment on that? It's a bit of a portmanteau question, but...
Yeah, I'm not sure I see the question. I mean, I think that the whole thing of, paying attention to where you are, I was calling it hierarchy, but I would say that the whole question of whether you're being dealt with fairly by the system is encapsulated in my use of hierarchy, and that animals do notice stuff like that. They have expectations of where they are given where they see themselves, and if they don't get that, they will get irritated by it. But I think that I don't see where are you going with your question.
Okay. In all of their talks, they're basically talking about systems that can be tested, that obviously evolved, had utility. Sue, for example, didn't like the idea of there being non-conscious states as opposed to conscious states, but underpinning all of the things that Terry was talking about is this very basic functional description of behavior.
Do you mean Terry or Franz?
Terry.
Deacon?
No, sorry.
Terry. Oh, I'm
Terry
sorry,
Stansky.
wrong Terry.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I'm sorry.
Can I try that one?
Yeah, try it.
The mic. So you mentioned the ultimatum game, this task economists use to look at sharing, and recent papers showed that the same areas that are associated with visceral disgust are active in the brain when people reject stingy or unfair offers in the ultimatum game. So I think what this means is that since the brain is a conservative system, the same kinds of areas that are associated with giving us guidance on how to get through the world, literally gut instinct, are active when we are potentially activating moral sentiments. So I think we're doing a much better job now of identifying the sort of functional basis for the moral emotions.
I could make a comment about that too. Not only is anterior insula and frontal insular cortex are activated by the unfair offers, the perceived unfair offers in the ultimatum game, in Sanfei's experiment, and that same region is activated in the experience of guilt and in the experience of trust, and also in deception. And a couple of other things as well that all basically involve sort of self-other relationships. But you could see a more basic function to this area, basically anterior insular cortex, and that is that it clearly has a lot to do with self-awareness, with introspection. And both Bud Craig, for example, has shown that there is a more recently evolved pathway proceeding up actually from the spinal cord that maintains that. And also, of course, Damasio's ideas with respect to the guidance in decision making is related to that. But or more broadly speaking, insular cortex is involved in the control of the ingestion of food, both the mechanical act of swallowing and also the taste. So when we speak of something as being disgusting, we can apply that to something which tastes bad, or we can reply it to something which is morally reprehensible. So what I'm suggesting is that the circuitry that way back was involved in the acceptance or rejection of food became generalized into a domain of sort of pro-social and anti-social activities between, where you have a love and hate and resentment and acceptance, so the whole array of complex emotions, I think essentially use the same neural substrate, but it's been greatly elaborated in us.
Can I make just a general comment, not to beat a dead horse, but if you're looking at the behavior of organisms and you're looking at it functionally, which everyone here does, the function of the behavior occurs at two levels, either phylogenetically, evolutionarily, in which case we talk about inherited behavior or fixed action patterns, or it occurs during the lifetime of the individual. Concentrating on the brain is certainly interesting and important, but you're concentrating on the proximate causes of the behavior. And I think we also need to know how the brain got to be constructed that way. And the answers to that, as I mentioned in my talk, are either looking in evolutionary biology, to understand how brains evolved, and to look at the individual history of that individual, of the individual learning history. Just looking at the brain by itself will not give you all the answers. It will tell you how the brain got to be that way and how it's correlated with some behavior, but it does not answer the question of the function of the behavior.
But just to make a point, no one advocates looking at the brain by itself. That would be
Right.
silly. I mean, we're all very much involved in essentially behavioral paradigms as well.
That's true, but the emphasis has certainly been...
Not mine. Not mine.
So,
You
so,
shouldn't speak for others.
so you,
I think we've gotten past scientific inquiry anyway of throwing stones at people as being reductionist or complexitive people. I think that everybody understands that you have to reduce when you're trying to figure out, and then you have to synthesize. And I think that most investigators now have that in mind, and that we shouldn't be throwing stones at each other on that.
Hank, somebody here, obviously, what is free will?
An invention?
An invention. Okay. The second one for you, which seems to reflect somebody who's been following Dan Dennis as
Can
well.
I just add a little footnote to that?
Yeah.
So in fact, it was invented, I think, back in the Middle Ages or something, wasn't it? I mean, somebody else knows the history, but before that, people knew about will. I mean, will is something that is kind of an elemental property all metals have, but the idea that it was somehow free was something that just popped up in history.
Well, I think we make choices, but our choices are determined by our genes and our individual history. The fact that we're unaware of the causes of our behavior most of the time doesn't mean that our behavior is free or willed in that regard. I mean, I think that, we talked about determinism and free will, and I agree with Sue, the two are incompatible. All scientists are determinists. I don't think we sit around spending a lot of time talking about determinism versus free will. As scientists, we just go about doing our science, assuming that the universe is orderly. But as far as human behavior is concerned, we have the illusion that we have free will because we seem to behave without lots of immediate causes. That doesn't mean that our behavior isn't caused. And as determinists, I think we all have to assume that our behavior is caused. And the quest for scientists is discover, as Sue pointed out, the quest for science is discover the causes.
I'd like to add something there as well, that you can just stay as a scientist and say, okay, I'm not going to believe in free will, but then still live your life, with the illusion. You can say, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to live as if free will, even though I don't believe in it. Or you can say, I'm not going to go on living this way. I'm going to drop it. I'm going to see through the illusion. That's what I've tried to do. And I'm sure there are others of you who have as well. And it can go away to the point when you just don't feel it anymore. And then, the world is quite different. Oh, I wonder what she's going to do next. Oh, how interesting.
So what does it feel like to have freed yourself from free will?
Liberating.
Yeah.
So there's a seminar that we'll be looking at. There's something coming up at the Salk later in this year, in which a number of California High Court judges come in, and they get tutorials from some of the scientists at Salk and around the area on issues that come up in courts of law. So they'll be looking at things like addiction and memory and so on and so forth. There was a question here that was for Rich McNally, but I think we can probably manage to deal with it. And it's looking at the sort of intersection of jurisprudence and the scientific information that goes into making decisions in courts. One aspect of this is if memory can't be trusted, even if intensely experienced, then what basis can eyewitness testimony be accepted in a court of law? And there's a whole bunch of other connections, things that go along with that, in the sense that if what we know about prediction and reward mechanisms underpins what we think addiction is, then there's a lot of people in jail who have, in one sense, in a biological sense, simply been experiencing prediction and reward circuitry's gone slightly awry. I mean, there's the my genes made me do it kind of argument. Do you want anyone to sort of have a go at that?
One thing, I think Elizabeth Loftus and her colleagues have more than answered the question about the reliability of eyewitness testimony. That's all I have to say.
So what would you do then with eyewitness testimony?
Be very afraid of it.
I think what you want is consistency. I mean, you want 5 people to have
I
the
was gonna
same
say,
view.
if 5 people
You
saw
want
the
to
same
have other kinds of evidence, convergent evidence, and that's certainly the neuroscience. Is nothing's proved until you have 5 or 6 or 7 different groups finding 6 things, the same thing 6 different ways. And I think the same is true in law. And I think what's interesting is that the science is having an impact on law in ways that Hank suggested. So that's important. You know, as we learn more as individuals, we learn more as a society as well.
But it's rather difficult. I mean, to push this to the ultimate, if you actually do insist that it's a deterministic universe and there is no free will, these kinds of social constructs that we've made have no grounding in philosophy.
And the argument that the genes made me do it is even worse when you start saying the memes made me do it. But in a way, that helps because you have to go to the limits of what you're talking about. And I think what happens then is that certain parts of law just have to disappear. You know, you don't punish people because deep down they're a bad person. What you can retain is that people learn, and therefore you have to apply rewards and punishments, that you have fairness in society, that people want to be supported, so you have to treat people fairly, and also some people you have to lock up because they're a danger to society. All that stays anyway. And I think we're going to have to work out a legal system in which those things are maintained, and some of these silly arguments are put where they belong.
Somebody has a card here that suggests sprinkling oxytocin on the food. But somebody else asked if you think it's going to be the next love potion, which I suppose it already is.
Sure, naturally it is. I mean, the best way to spike your oxytocin, again, absent giving birth or breastfeeding, is to have sex. So the way you feel after sex is driven largely by oxytocin. Feeding will also do it. So as we eat, we will do that, which is, I think, why we have many of our meetings over food. And I hope we'll have some nice social intercourse over our meal as well. As soon as possible. And I do have some oxytocin in my pocket that I'll sprinkle on everyone's food as I go out.
You just keep on using that I word, don't you? Does anybody want to comment on the relevance of...
Actually, I have a question. Does it really survive the digestive tract?
No, it doesn't.
Okay.
No, right. It's either IVIM or IM, so no, it doesn't, unfortunately. In fact, that's one of the problems. Although we should say, when men are given this, a significant proportion will become sexually aroused. So it's a pretty happy hormone, but yeah.
Aren't there studies showing that it's elevated in people who are in love? Or I've heard about that, but I haven't read them.
No, episodically. It's just up and down.
Up and down?
Sorry. It's late. It's pulsatile is what I meant to say. People, please.
Anybody want to comment on the relevance of anything that Freud said?
Now we're getting silly.
No, it's one of the questions, it's one of the cards.
Really?
I mean, you know, you have been talking about the conscious and the unconscious.
What did Freud say?
I think it was important that he said that a lot of our mental life is unconscious. I mean, I think
Yes.
that's a huge contribution, and you know, I think we're still there.
I don't, because I think he took, I mean, all that had been said about the unconscious by Myers and William James and all sorts of people before that, and Helmholtz, I mean, lots of people had done experimental studies of it and were really getting somewhere. And then he comes along and puts this whole sexual orientation on it and this kind of active unconscious, which doesn't turn out to fit very well with experimental results we've had since.
Right.
I just think he diverted the fledgling idea of the unconscious into a most unfortunate direction.
Would anybody like to comment on that what a statement I made earlier, which was the sort of talking about a coming together of Eastern and Western positions, that scientists are putting meditators in fMRI machines and so on and so forth. Do you have any sense that would lead to something important, or is it on the level of what the bleep?
I think these professional meditators that have been put in the machines clearly, you know, the data, Richie Davidson and stuff, they do have different properties that make sense. I mean, people who play the piano have different brain signals as well, and they should. They work for decades to develop these capacities. So I
Yeah,
don't-
it's just that both you and Sue used the word mindfulness quite
okay, well,
mindfully.
yeah.
And to most people, that means something that Thich Nhat Hanh would make you say, or that the Buddha would say, or John Kabat-Zinn would say. I mean, these are obviously concepts that are not mainstream science yet.
I think there are two different things going on here in the convergence between science and Buddhism. One is, as you've described, scientific studies of what's happening in meditation. And that is at the moment a big mess without real theoretical direction. So what I hope of that is that we'll get out of it some theories. It's quite clear that long-term meditators are able to do things with their brains that normal people can't, to do with training attention predominantly, in different ways, in different traditions. But that, I don't know where that'll go, but I hope it'll go somewhere. The other is the coming together on a theoretical level of things like the concept of no self in Buddhism, with the sort of ideas we've been talking about today to do with there not being a kind of thing called a self that's in there, or a thing called consciousness. Some of the ideas about contingent dependent origination in Buddhism, which are kind of basic scientific ideas that everything has a prior cause and everything goes on to cause things. So there's some coming together there theoretically, but these two things are really quite separate. I'm optimistic that this will be a very fruitful kind of companionship between these two different disciplines, but they're pretty far apart at the moment.
Okay. It's actually 7 o'clock. I'm sure you're all getting signals from your systems that you need to sate them in some fashion or other. So thank you for your patience. Thank the panel, please. And one last word from Sherma. No? No. Okay.
Dinner is served. Bon
Dinner is
appetit.